No promises I'll get through all of it. Knowing both of these two, it's probably like 4 hours long. 2 hours long. That's my fault for assuming, I guess.
Keep saying the purpose of the alliance is to contain Russia. Contain Russia from doing what? Invading their neighboring countries? Like, if Russia didn't engage in these actions, it shouldn't really matter. That again, we're always framing this in the case of U.S. security interests versus Russian security interests. Is Ukrainian security interest just not at play here? Do we just not care about this? And Ukraine has a genuine security interest in that they want themselves to be a sovereign country with the right to decide which alliances they will or will not join. And the idea that there might be NATO bases here in the future, that Biden is open to inspection, the idea that down the road maybe second strike capabilities are lost in Russia and now they just get nuked by the US because we can do so with impunity, maybe that'll happen 30 years from now. So now today we need to take over Ukraine. I don't know. I totally don't buy that as a reason. I feel like you could use that same justification then for Russia to essentially invade anybody they want that's near their borders and isn't claimed up by normativity from that. You're not telling me whether Russia's decision is right or wrong, or whether it's more.
What if the whole video was like this? What if the whole video was just this music? It's still mirrored? Oh yeah.
Morally or whatever justified. You're just telling me that Russia will seek to basically annex whatever neighbor it can if it perceives there to be a security threat, which again is just a stronger argument for a more aggressive expansion.
Violent revolution.
Why are you saying democratic when part of the reasons why it was protested so heavily is because he literally tried to pass like 10 anti-protest laws? That's not democratic either. I'd support from the majority of the United States. Yeah, but you're realist analysis suck. We are debating about the justification of Russia's invasion of Ukraine. The February invasion of Ukraine cannot be justified by any means that are not overt Russian propaganda or statements that entirely dismiss the sovereignty and right to self-determination of the Ukrainian people. This invasion into Ukraine must be opposed by any means necessary, short of direct military conflict, by anyone in the West who values any of the basic tenets of liberalism or the rights of any nation to determine their own path forward in the world. Tonight, Nick might try and convince you that NATO promised it would not expand 1 inch further to the east, ignoring that these comments were originally made by Secretary of State James Baker in 1990 with regards to NATO expanding its military presence into eastern Germany, which remains demilitarized to this day. In an interview with Russia Beyond the Headlines, Gorbachev himself, the Soviet leader in 1990, during these negotiations, responded to a question asking why NATO promises hadn't been legally encoded, with Gorbachev...
Wait, why did Nick shave his beard? When did Nick Fuentes not have a beard? When did that happen? I feel like that was the last vestige of him not looking like a permanent 15-year-old. He had a beard? Yeah, he had a beard for a while. It's been like a year? I guess I haven't seen him in a while. Oh, okay, well. Wait, is Nick pro-Russia? Yeah, of course. He's pro-Russia, and he's gonna use the exact same arguments that Mershimer used. The exact same identical arguments, because... because everyone who disagrees with me is a Nazi, but unironically, literally, 100% fully sincerely. Alright.
Responding, and I quote, "The topic of NATO expansion was not discussed at all, and it wasn't brought up in those years. Another issue we brought up was discussed, making sure that NATO's military structures would not advance and that additional armed forces would not be deployed on the territory of the then GDR after German reunification. Baker's statement was made in that context. Everything that could have been and needed to be done to solidify the political obligation was done and fulfilled," end quote. Nick may try to say that some verbal assurances were made between leaders, but why would anyone ever expect the geopolitical landscape of an entire continent be dictated by verbal agreements made in 1990 between only 2 nations, one that no longer even exists? This is even less reliable when you consider that the entire security situation would have radically changed with the rapid dissolution of the Soviet Union and, along with it, the Warsaw Pact. Perhaps Nick will try to tell you that NATO represents a real security threat against Russia. To that, I have to ask, a security threat preventing what exactly? Is it the invasion of Russia, which there is absolutely zero precedent for any NATO country doing? Is it the destruction of Russian forces in Russian territory, which there is also no precedent for any NATO country doing? Is it the annihilation of Russian forces in Russian allied territory by NATO countries, which has only happened when Russia has lied about its deployed paramilitary forces, as they did in 2018 in Syria during the Battle of Qashm? Perhaps, if I may suggest,
Oops.
instead what NATO represents is a threat to Russia's ability to undermine and interfere with the politics of its neighboring countries. Imagine a situation where Russia recognizes two independent, self-proclaimed republics that no one else in the world recognizes. They then send in their military to secure peace, not only in the contested region, but to march far beyond that to the rest of the country, simply out of fear of the election of a democratic leader who favors dealing with the West more than Russia. I'm not even talking about the modern-day conflict in Ukraine, but instead, this is the story of the 2008 Russo-Georgian War, where instead of the self-proclaimed republics of Luhansk and Donetsk, it was the self-proclaimed republics of South Ossetia and Abkhazia. Instead of securing the important geographical funnel of Ukraine, it was establishing loyalist states in the South Caucasus region. How many of these strategically vital wars are we forced to allow Russia to engage in? I wonder if Nick will bring up broken promises and agreements of the Soviet Union and Russia that were actually put to paper. Could be the 1990 Paris Charter signed by the USSR, which, and I quote, fully recognized the freedom of states to choose their own security arrangements. Will Nick mention the NATO-Russia Founding Act of 1997, after 4 months of intense negotiations between the Secretary General of NATO, Javier Solana, and the Russian Foreign Minister Primakov, which established the PJC, or Russian NATO Permanent Joint Council, that committed both NATO and Russia to, and I quote, build together a lasting and inclusive peace in the Euro-Atlantic area on the principles of democracy and cooperative security? I wonder if he'll mention any of the Budapest memorandums. 3 separate agreements signed in 1994 between the world's nuclear powers to eliminate the existence of nuclear weapons in Belarus, Kazakhstan, and Ukraine. An agreement, I should say, that required these 3 countries to give up the most reliable means they had of securing their sovereignty in exchange for promises of, and again I quote, independence and sovereignty in the existing borders, and a
You think Destiny has a script for the opening? Yeah, obviously, of course. He definitely did his research. That's good. How the fuck do you not just die right now? You don't get fall damage if you jump into the spirit spring while on a horse. It, like, cushions you.
refrain from the threat or the use of force against Belarus, Kazakhstan, and Ukraine, signed by the United States, the UK, and Russia. Maybe Nick will attack the idea of NATO being a defensive alliance and point to times where NATO has indeed acted aggressively in the past. We're supposed to ignore that none of these aggressions happened towards Russia itself, of course, but I'm curious which interventions particularly threaten Putin. Does NATO's intervention in 1995 in the Bosnian War threaten Putin's plans for neighboring countries? An intervention that ended with a precision bombing campaign that brought about an end to the indiscriminate shelling of civilian cities and towns, ethnic cleansing, and systematic mass rapes being committed during said conflict? Is Putin worried that his attacks today on Mariupol, Kharkiv, Kherson, and against countless civilians in Ukraine resemble too closely the absolute destruction he wrought in 2015 at the city of Aleppo during the Syrian civil war, or the 27,000 civilians killed when Grozny was decimated during the First Chechen War in 1994 within his own borders? Does NATO intervention in Kosovo stop the ethnic cleansing of Albanians by Yugoslavia scare Putin? Does he see himself as a Milosevic, the first sitting head of state to be charged with war crimes, a man who was complacent with genocide occurring under his own military? Is he worried that he may want a repeat of what he did in Georgia, where the Russian-backed and recognized South Ossetia forces were responsible for an ethnic cleansing of Georgians, with almost 20,000 of them being displaced from their homes? Does the 2011 NATO intervention in Libya scare Putin? Does he imagine himself to be Gaddafi, a man who imprisoned, tortured, and gassed his own citizens? The man who had the incredulity to accuse Al-Qaeda of using LSD and Nest cafes to poison the minds of his political adversaries?
The Fourth Reich begins.
Maybe Nick will repeat the Kremlin's talking points about the fear of Nazis in Ukraine. Where are they? Where are all these Nazis? Every time I hear someone complain about Nazis, the only two things they seem to bring up are the Azov Battalion, a small force numbering less than 1,000 soldiers, and Stepan Bandera, a man who died in 1959 that remains incredibly divisive in Ukraine to this day.
This is also
I'll be tickled if Nick wants to take up the position that we should be canceling people based on problematic histories and their associations with far-right movements, but I suppose we'll see what he does. Far-right Party of Svoboda today has only 15,000 members across the entirety of some 44 million people who live in Ukraine, and they only hold a single seat in that parliament. Polling data has shown that Ukrainians are some of the most welcoming people towards Jewish people in all of Eastern Europe. Between May and August of 2019, Ukraine was the only country in the world, other than Israel, Nick's favorite country, to have both a Jewish head of government, Volodymyr Groysman, and Jewish head of state, Volodymyr Zelensky. The only time in Ukraine's recent history when the Svoboda Party even had any real political influence at all was when they were being propped up by Yanukovych, the pro-Russian president. If Russia was so concerned about fascists, why would she not turn her eyes to the Russian imperial movement that operates so freely out of St. Petersburg? This is a movement that coordinates with several neo-Nazi movements all throughout Europe, even training 3 Swedish neo-Nazis before sending them back to Sweden, where they bombed a center for asylum seekers, among other attacks in Europe they've been involved in. Nothing operates within Russian borders so freely without Putin's implicit approval, so why does he not remove this organization from existence? Clearly, because Putin explicitly supports and is supported by Nazis. Dmitry Utkin is the founder of Russia's Wagner Group, and he bears Waffen-SS tattoos on his collarbone and chest. Commanding officers have been seen sporting Wehrmacht hats, giving Nazi salutes, spraying swastikas on desecrated houses and places of worship while conducting operations in Syria, the Central African Republic, and Libya on behalf of the Russian state. Lastly, maybe Nick will just appeal to the illegal coup known in Ukraine as the Revolution of Dignity, staged in 2014 by America in order to overthrow Yanukovych. There's not a shred of verifiable evidence for this. The Euromaidan protests erupted across Ukraine from late 2013 to early 2014 for a whole host of reasons. It wasn't solely due to Yanukovych, who, against the will of the parliament, exited a non-exclusive free trade agreement with the EU and entered the exclusive Eurasian Economic Union with Russia. Ukraine was widely considered in the 2010s to be one of the most corrupt countries in the world. The actual ousting of Yanukovych would only happen after he ordered his police to open fire on protesters, killing over 100 in the span of a few days, with Yanukovych ultimately fleeing the country in fear of repercussions. Who knows, maybe the shooters were secret CIA agents as well. Russia's right to security does not supersede Ukraine's right to sovereignty. If Russia has a problem with all of its neighboring members choosing to look west for their future instead of to Russia, perhaps it's an issue for Russia to sort through. Nations should be able to dictate their own security without being threatened by a neighboring power hell-bent on rebuilding a dying empire.
Mr. Fuentes, go ahead, sir.
All right. Wow. Very interesting opening statement, but I think the rebuttal, the counter argument is supposed to come after my argument. I didn't hear a whole lot of justification for the NATO position, only just sort of these preemptive counter arguments against some of the so-called Kremlin arguments, so-called pro-Russian arguments. I didn't pre-write my statement, so I'm just going off the cuff here. I'll say this. You know, a lot of what I just heard is really wholly irrelevant to the core argument in favor of the Russian intervention, or the argument that the Russian special military operation in Ukraine is appropriate and reasonable and limited in terms of its objectives. My position has little to do with the Azov Battalion or the Galician far right. It has little to do even with the claims that the U.S. had involvement in the Maidan Revolution in 2014. It has nothing to do with the assurances made to Gorbachev that Putin claims were there and others deny. It has nothing to do with any of that. It has to do principally with the expansion of NATO into Eastern Europe and specifically into Ukraine. And if you go through a timeline of events, it's really quite simple. In 1991, of course, you have the dissolution of the Soviet Union, and this is you know, Putin famously describes this as a geopolitical catastrophe, and what he's referring to is the fact that overnight Russia loses half of its population and parts of its territory that it had controlled for hundreds of years, formerly under the Russian Empire and then under the Soviet Union. Ukraine in particular was controlled by Russia for hundreds of years. It was only an accident of how Lenin organized the Soviet Union administratively that Ukraine had any kind of autonomy or any kind of nationhood at all. But what liberals and what the NATO faction likes to do is say that after the dissolution of the Soviet Union, after the former Soviet Union countries declared independence, that there's no takesies, backsies, that's just set in stone. These accidents, administrative accidents of world history are now locked in.
Wait, what? You could just reconquer?
And former Russian lands, whether they be Russian Empire or Soviet Union, are forever lost now. And the so-called sovereignty of nations that never really existed, states that never existed,
I see Fuentes has been watching Hassan.
And there's nothing that Russia can do about it. I find that problematic as far as the sovereignty argument goes. But let's take it a step further. NATO was formed explicitly to counter Russian power on the European continent. Of course, NATO was formed in response to Stalin's control over Eastern Europe, and it was formed to shore up Western Europe against the threat of the Soviet Union, which emerged from World War II as the second world superpower. Why then did, after the fall of the Soviet Union, the halving of Russia's population, the decimation of the Russian military, decimation of the Russian Empire, did NATO, a defensive alliance formed explicitly as a counterbalance to Russia, not only not disband with the Soviet Union and the Warsaw Pact, remain in place, but actually then expand further. And in 1997, that's exactly what they did. They announced their intention to expand. And there was, of course, the first tranche of NATO expansion in 1999 to Poland, Czech Republic, and Hungary. The second tranche of expansion in 2004, which included the Baltic states, as well as
we use our regular
Slovenia
weapons,
and other nations. And then the third tranche in 2009 with Albania and with Croatia. What's more, in 2008, NATO declared that they would respect the aspirations of Ukraine and Georgia to join NATO. It's at this point that Russia draws a firm red line. And Russia says at the outset, at the Bucharest conference in 2008, that Ukraine and Georgia would not be permitted to join NATO. They say that that's unacceptable to their security posture, that's unacceptable to their national interests. And of course, Russia then intervenes in the Georgian civil war in Abkhazia and South Ossetia to that end, destabilize Georgia, prevent them from joining Ukraine. Of course, then in 2014, you've got the Maidan Revolution. A pro-Western leader is installed. Russia intervenes in Crimea and Donbass, again, to secure their port at Sevastopol, secure their Black Sea fleet and their power projection capability in the region, and then has fueled the civil war in Donbass ever since for the past 8 years, again, to prevent Ukraine from joining NATO. It is at this point in 2014 that we saw really the fundamental root causes of the crisis. For the 22 years between the fall of the Soviet Union and the Maidan Revolution, there's no crisis in Ukraine. There is no war, there is no invasion, there are not hundreds of thousands of troops on the border. The status quo, which was to have Ukraine as a neutral buffer state, means that there is peace. It is not until the 2014 coup, when the prospect of Ukraine joining NATO becomes a real and distinct possibility, again, 6 years of NATO ignoring Russia's security concerns, that the crisis begins, and Russia invades Crimea and begins fueling the separatists in Donbass. It is at this point that NATO and the West begin a full-scale demonization campaign of Russia. And they say that Russia is doing this because, and we've heard the usual line, Russia is evil, Putin is evil. He is a revanchist, meaning that his principal goal, as Destiny said, is to rebuild the Soviet Union or the Russian Empire at any cost. And it's sort of an interesting prospect.
Well, wasn't Nick's opening argument basically they have a right to undo old territorial losses?
Separatists in Chechnya, as well as provide material support to separatists in Abkhazia and South Ossetia. You know, that's some empire-building project that for 14 years, there's no real expansion of the Russian state, again, outside of arguably 2 small breakaway regions in Georgia. It's in 2014 in response
Don't these arguments sound like tanky arguments? Tankies are fascists.
In Kiev, that Russia begins its attack on Ukraine. But where was the provocation? Of course, the provocation was the continued so-called aspirations of Ukraine to join NATO, and then the ouster of democratically elected and most trusted politician in Ukraine, Yanukovych, and the installment of a rapidly anti-Russian leader. So what precipitated the crisis truly? Well, it was the Western forces. Since then, the West engages in this demonization campaign and says all along, even though and honestly, when Russia invaded Crimea,
I don't understand why Nick is pro-Russia. Isn't he a legit Nazi? Yes. Those aren't contradictory positions. Russia is literally, without exaggeration, the largest bastion of international fascism in the world right now. For a long time, it was America. That America would install fascist dictators to prevent countries from falling to communism. But no longer. Russia has ties to basically every far-right group, like, all over the world. Mostly in Eastern Europe, but, like, their reach is massive. The only reason the Nazis in Ukraine don't like Russia is because Russia's ultranationalism is specifically defined against Russian occupation. That's the only reason why. Ideologically, the Azov Battalion doesn't have anything against Russia. Legitimately, they don't. Ideologically similar. They're just for another team. Let me pee, then we'll continue. Wah.
Crimea, this caught the West off guard. The killing of the separatists in Donbass caught the West off guard. But overnight, you know, whereas Obama said in 2012, the 80s called, they want their foreign policy back, and Hillary Clinton hit the reset button with Sergei Lavrov. Overnight, we determined that Putin was always no good, evil, dictator, and so on, with these revanchist claims after his response to the Maidan Revolution. Does the United States abandon its ambitions for Ukraine to join NATO? Of course not. And these are some of the precipitating factors for the current crisis. In September of 2020, the United States flies B-52 bombers across the edge of the Crimean Peninsula and near Donbass. A very provocative action. These are nuclear-capable bombers. In June 2021, 6 months later, the United Kingdom sails a British destroyer, the HMS Defender, into disputed Black Sea waters, where it's chased
Isn't
out
Nick one of those West is best types? Why is he defending Russia from an anti-West
Ukraine and the United
POV?
States signed
No.
the Charter on Strategic Partnership.
Nick is a neo-Nazi. Nick's patriotism is only a cover that allows him to sell his neo-Nazi beliefs under the guise of being American first. He doesn't care about America. In fact, he's been pretty open in the past that he thinks that America is a Jewish-controlled Zionist country, because he's a Nazi. He is not any more allegiant to the West than he would be to Russia or to China or any other country. He's just a Nazi. That is the main thing that matters to him.
And this is an updated document from 2008. Washington says it supports Ukraine's, quote, aspirations to join NATO. October 26, 2021, Ukraine begins using Turkish Bayraktar drones in Donbass, which decisively, of course, turned the tide of the 2020 Nagorno-Karabakh war. And, of course, they purchased these Turkish drones from Turkey, a NATO country. And this is the rearmament of Ukraine. And then finally, the last straw comes in February 19, 2022, when Vladimir Zelensky at the Munich Security Conference suggests that Ukraine may rearm itself with nuclear weapons. And so you see in 2014, the installment of the pro-Western government and the prospect that Ukraine will join NATO, something that's unacceptable to Russia, which they had made clear since 2008. And then you see with the precipitating factors throughout 2020, 2021, and finally in 2022, once again, a security situation that is increasingly unacceptable for the Russian state. A nuclear Ukraine, antagonism by the British Navy in the Black Sea, by the American Air Force over Crimea and Donbass. Once again, unfazed NATO expansion into Ukraine. And I would point out, for anybody that says that Russia is some revanchist state or something like this, what does Russia have to fear from a defensive alliance? I'll reiterate. NATO was formed explicitly, this was its express purpose, to counter Russian power on the European continent. The founding purpose of NATO is to contain Russia. After the Soviet Union collapses and Russia is weak and vulnerable and amputated, NATO expands in 3 major tranches, 13 countries over the past 20 years. The combined military spending of NATO exceeds $1 trillion in just 2021 alone, compared to Russia, which has only spent $67 billion on its military. They say that Russia is revanchist because it expanded allegedly into Crimea, Donbass, Abkhazia, and South Ossetia. NATO has expanded to 13 additional countries. They talk about Russian aggression when NATO has done far more military interventions in this century in Afghanistan, Iraq, Libya, and elsewhere across Africa and the Middle East, whereas Russia had a minor engagement in the Syrian civil war. And fundamentally, what it comes down to is the ignorance of the Americans and the refusal to acknowledge that America is not a benign hegemon. We are the most powerful country in the world. The purpose of the military alliance is to contain Russia, and Russia, just like Ukraine, has a legitimate security interest that it is seeking to protect. And so therefore, the special operation in Ukraine is something that is reasonable and pursuant to those valid strategic goals. The United States should listen to Russia, negotiate with Russia on some items that they can find common ground on. And if they had done that back in January, there would be no conflict. So that concludes my opening statement.
Go ahead, Destiny. We'll do some questions back and forth, and we'll maybe take questions from the audience as well. But as you guys know, the main part will be you guys questioning each other. So I'll begin with you, Destiny.
So before we dive in, because we agree on maybe half of this, and then some of this we have pretty big disagreements on, I'm curious if we If I grant almost everything you've said, let's say that I grant that Russia has a legitimate security interest in having Ukraine.
Oh God,
be
it has a
vassal state
phase
of part of
2.
their big union. Let's say that I do grant that. Why would Russia's security interests there supersede Ukraine's sovereignty to make decisions for themselves? Why, like, under what? How would you tell an entire country, like, listen, we know you guys want to look more west, we know you want into these free trade agreements, but we can't do that because Daddy Russia's scared, so you kind of just have to cock yourselves eternally to that country. Good luck.
Yeah, see, I've heard that argument before, and it's this question of security versus sovereignty, and unfortunately, I think the consequence of this NATO expansion and everything is that Zelensky was emboldened. The question is, to me, whether there's sovereignty or security, I think is sort of an abstract question. The question is, why is Russia currently in Ukraine? Well, I guess you would say that Russia having some kind of control over Ukraine at all, or influence over Ukraine at all, compromises their sovereignty in favor of Russia's security. I would say this is just how great powers behave. This is, unfortunately, fortunately or unfortunately, this is just how the world is. The question is, how do we prevent conflict in Ukraine? Why are there currently people dying? Why is there a war going on? And that is because NATO has expanded and emboldened Zelensky, and they have not negotiated with Russia. Now Russia has had to undertake something which, that they've had to demonstrate what a sphere of influence is really about, which is there's an underlying threat of the use of force. I agree with you in some sense that, Ukraine must be a vassal state for Russia to have its security, but this is how great powers operate. This is how the entire Western Hemisphere is organized. This is how Western Europe is organized.
If that's the response, then why can't I just...
All right, sorry. That was our best attempt so far. Hold on. Earlier, somebody said something about Thought Slime being weird on Twitch. Did I read that correctly? TS is being weird, by the way.
I have this fantasy, BP, of being on his stream where, you know how he's always eating on stream when he has a guest on to, like, show dominance? I don't know if you knew this. This is the thing.
What?
He does. I have this fantasy of, like, going on his stream and, like, eating a big submarine sandwich as I'm talking. And then when he's like, "Can you stop eating the sandwich? It's really distracting." I go, "Oh, I'm sorry." And I put it aside, and then I pull out a big bowl of spaghetti and start eating it. This is my dream. I have this.
You have to understand, folks. To a person like Thought Slime, that right there is the apex of conquest in life. Okay, you would ride that one to the grave. I don't eat while talking to people. I actually really hate eating while talking. Like, I actually specifically do this, I think, less than, like, anyone else. Is he thinking of Destiny? Because there's a meme about Destiny eating pizza when the other person is talking. I don't know. Yeah, that was pretty nanners. Was he even talking about you? I guess he didn't say my name, but the person with the clip said it. Okay.
So I'm looking for some normativity from you, not just descriptions. But if we are just going to go on descriptions, you can't really then attack NATO for continuing to expand, because I would just utter the same back to you. Well, this is just what the United States would do. Of course, we'd want to expand our sphere of influence and include Ukraine into NATO. But at that point, you're not really left with being able to defend Russia's actions any more than I would defend NATO's actions, including Ukraine.
Well, here's what I would say the difference is that for Russia, Ukraine is a vital security interest. For NATO, Ukraine is not a vital security interest, and that really is where the difference lies. Is that
see, these are Mearsheimer
once
talking
again, when
points.
You consider that, and you could say that, well, Ukraine has a right to join the NATO alliance. They may prefer,
which I would say.
There's a plurality of people in Ukraine who want Ukraine to be a NATO member state.
Mm-hmm.
But what exactly does this do for the United Kingdom? What exactly, and really more fundamentally, what does this have anything? How does this benefit the United States of America? Because ultimately, the NATO defensive alliance and security guarantee is built on the American military more than anything else, more than the paltry contributions of Germany, France, and the United Kingdom. It's about the American defense guarantee. And so the question is, as far as Russia intervening, this is a defensive act shoring up a vital security interest. NATO expansion into Slovenia, Croatia, Ukraine. How is this? And I guess I would throw it back to you. Why is this a vital security interest for the NATO countries, and more specifically the United States, which underlies the whole security guarantee?
Well, so firstly, it doesn't have to be a vital security interest. The membership into NATO is contingent upon a country wanting to join, and then contingent upon NATO membership countries wanting countries to join. It doesn't necessarily have to represent a security interest for everybody to allow countries into the fold, right? We would argue, like, did the Baltic states represent like an actual security interest for the rest of Europe? Did any of southern, like, did these countries need to join NATO to shore up the security of Europe? Other people might argue that the broader peace enjoyed by Europe might be because of the expansion of NATO, that it's hard to attack a country that is under this umbrella, this guarantee of safety and peace. Other people might say, if we start seeing massive excursion or massive fleeings of refugees and everything from Ukraine, they might point to that and go, oh, well, look, there's the security interest. Similar to when we had the massive fleeing of Syrians from Syria and we had a refugee crisis across all Europe. Well, now we have refugees fleeing from Ukraine because of actions that Russia is taking into Ukraine. I noticed that when you frame this conversation a lot, I'm not blaming you for this, but it's often framed as like an issue between Russia and the United States security interest. What is the Russian security interest? What is the United States security interest? What about Ukraine's security interest, right? If we talk to any of the other Eastern European NATO member states, like, oh, well, like, how are the Baltics feeling right now? How are Poland, how are Romania, how are you guys feeling right now, NATO? They're probably feeling pretty good. They're probably feeling a lot more secure. If you were to ask Ukraine, I imagine they would probably feel pretty secure as well. They probably wouldn't have to worry about their ports being taken over by Russians, breakaway states being recognized as independent. I think it's worth addressing. So to answer your question, like, in one, the security interest isn't necessarily relevant. That's not a requirement to join NATO. But two, if we are going to talk about security interests, I think we should be able to talk about the Ukrainian security interests, which is keeping their country free of Russian meddling.
Well, and I think that's actually, to ask the question is to answer it. What is Ukraine's security interest? Ukraine's not very secure right now. Right? Russia is invading Ukraine. Russia is currently bombing Ukraine and involved in a full-scale invasion of Ukraine. And so, what was Zelensky?
Remember, he's copying
Mearsheimer's
points. His argument isn't that Russia's justified. His argument is like the victim blaming.
He didn't say, because I know you're very, very technical about the details. He didn't say explicitly, we're going to get nukes, but he says, look, Ukraine disarmed because of the Budapest Memorandum. He said, we've asked the signatories 3 times since 2014 to shore up their promise from the Budapest Memorandum, which is to protect the territorial integrity and sovereignty of Ukraine. And we're going to ask them 1/4 and final time. But if they don't do it, then we're going to rescind all the material promises of the Budapest Memorandum, which is like an implication, which is very startling, and I think you would admit, a very provocative thing.
But it's fair.
It's almost suggesting, and you may say it's fair, but it's suggesting nuclear rearmament on Russia's border. And so, the question about security, it's like, well, this Ukrainian policy of poking the bear and saying, we're not giving up Donbass, we're not giving up Crimea, and
poking
and
the bear by not ceding territory.
And then they get invaded by Russia.
Ooh,
obviously, this is, and the point I'm trying to make is this: the expansion of NATO, it's not enhancing the security of Ukraine. It's not enhancing the security of the United States or Russia. It's a reckless action, and the proof of the pudding is in the eating, because the outcome has been catastrophic for the whole world. We've now got, potentially a shooting war, which could break out between Russia and the United States. This is what Zelensky is inviting. Zelensky is saying, let's have a no-fly zone over Ukraine. You understand what that entails. And the United States won't even send their fighter jets to Poland to compensate Poland, right? And so the point is this: is this expansion? It's not good for Ukraine's security, clearly, or Russia's, or the United States. What should have been done is that Russia and the United States and Ukraine could have had a constructive dialogue about surface-to-surface missiles, about the Russian base in Crimea. And there's this, and I don't want to ramble too much. This is my last point. I'll let you respond to this. You talked about we can't enhance one country's security at the expense of another. Well, let's say, for the sake of argument, that NATO expansion enhances the security of Ukraine. Because you're right. Would this prevent Russia from intervening if it was a done deal? Probably, yes. But what does this entail? This entails that NATO now has the right to put military bases, surface-to-surface missiles, potentially ABM platforms and other things in Ukraine. It means that there's a NATO naval base in Crimea if that becomes part of Ukraine again. this is a detriment to Russian security. So by bringing NATO forces, and again, and what is the purpose of NATO? The purpose of NATO is to contain Russia. So you've got NATO now, again, its purpose is to contain Russia in Ukraine right on their border. And you know how strategically important the Black Sea is. You brought those bases to Russia's doorstep. Is this a detriment to Russia's security interest? Yes. So if you talk about, enhancing one nation's security at the expense of another, that's what NATO enlargement does. The status quo ensure the security of all the countries involved.
I'm glad that I'm listening to this, because if I can get a debate with Mershimer, I think this will actually prepare me for it a lot. Okay. Nick is a neo-Nazi, and he's using Mershimer's arguments as a way of defending Russia. Like, obviously, Nick doesn't give a fuck about territorial integrity or, like, geopolitical balance being maintained. Like, obviously he doesn't, because that would require him to cede, like, a fuck ton of positions that he holds otherwise. Like, clearly that's not the case, But he's using this, like, this phony realism as a way of defending the position he actually cares about here, which is, Russia is a fascist state, and therefore he wants to defend it. So, yeah.
And, I think the record of history is clear on this.
I don't like that it's equivalently talked about that, Ukraine's security interest is to not be fucked with, and Russia's security interest is to continue to fuck with. So I'm going to be a little bit more lenient on the side of Ukraine that doesn't want to be invaded, that doesn't want its territorial integrity constantly threatened, that doesn't want, which I am glad at least you acknowledge, that all of those Eastern separatist groups are fully funded and backed by Russian militaries, right? Lithuania doesn't have these problems. Estonia doesn't have these problems, right? You don't have these problems in countries that have joined NATO. And when you're Ukrainian and you look to the north and you look to the west and you look and you see these countries are in NATO, don't have to worry about Russia coming over to threaten your territorial integrity. I don't understand how we can say that there isn't a vital security interest there for Ukraine unless you're literally saying, well, there's not because, look, Russia made it not, right? I don't know if that's necessarily a fair thing to say, that they don't have a security interest because now Russia is afraid of them dealing with their security interests. We talk about it's so ironic, and this is another thing that's ultra ironic too, is we talk about NATO is an organization without purpose. It was created to only contain the Soviet Union and the Warsaw Pact, and in '91 it should have been disbanded. People say that. Other people say, well, maybe the expansion of NATO can ensure greater periods of peace and prosperity for Europe, which arguably it has. But today you have countries like Sweden and in Finland talking about potentially joining NATO just because of how aggressive Russia's been acting. So while you might say on one hand, well, look, it's not in the security interest of Ukraine because now Russia's attacking them, I could say on the other hand, well, look, this isn't in the interest of Russia because now everybody else wants to join NATO. It feels like, and even if you are pro-Russian, you have to acknowledge that today the NATO alliance is probably stronger than it ever has been. There has been a revitalization across even NATO skeptic countries like France, even Germany that was unwilling to go as far with some of these sanctions and military equipment, even Poland that initially didn't want to contribute as much. These countries have been revitalized in purpose, united against Russia, to where if Russia doesn't succeed in Ukraine, or even if they do succeed in Ukraine, it feels like now all they've done is create a stronger NATO. I feel like something that the United States has done a decent job of, say for Iraq, at least in the past 30 years, feels like exerting soft power instead of this hard power, this idea you need to invade and take over everything, maybe would have been a better route to go for Russia, rather than, I'm going to Sevastopol, I'm going to Crimea, I'm stealing your base, I'm funding these separatists, and I'm going to invade the fuck out of your country if you don't do exactly what I say. I feel like the era for that politics is past, and all Russia has done with their current actions is undermine the security of all of Europe, revitalize NATO, and threaten Ukraine's sovereignty for no real justification of its own other than they want control of that piece of land.
Well, and you even conceded though, it's, there is a vital security interest in Ukraine. It's not just because they're greedy and everything. And I would flip it on its head and say, we talk about the security of Ukraine. We're not talking about a bilateral security guarantee. We're talking about NATO, which is an empire in a sense that, the NATO states are beholden to the United States. I mean, we know this, that Georgia and Ukraine,
other NATO countries are not vassals of the U.S.
objections of France and Germany in 2008. We know that the United States run NATO. We know that the United States has always run NATO. So when we talk about Ukraine, it's fine and well to say, oh, well, Ukraine might be concerned or something. But we are talking then, you sort of lose your ability to talk about, oh, well, my right, my self-determination, when you're talking about inviting another empire and becoming an outpost of another empire. next to Russia and putting NATO bases and listening to NATO decisions and NATO military and becoming a vassal state of NATO in a certain sense, and with the European Union too, with the currency and economic union. Are we going to pretend that there's no pressure exerted on Ukraine from Brussels and the EU? There's no pressure exerted on Ukraine in NATO from Washington, D.C. as a result of their being joined up with these supranational unions? Of course there is. And I also want to frame the conversation this way. Everybody talks about big bad Russia, and Russia's this revanchist and Russian aggression and so on. But let's flip the script and let's put ourselves in Russia's shoes. The combined military budget of NATO, you've got more than $800 billion in military spending for the United States, $800 billion, and $350 billion for the rest of the NATO countries. So you have $1.2 trillion in military spending from NATO, which is now expanding. And again,
but who's the aggressor?
You can say NATO doesn't have a purpose.
Is NATO attacking Russia?
I think that's a little disingenuous. The purpose of NATO is to contain the Soviet Union. The purpose of NATO is to contain Russia. They're not expanding into Africa. They're not expanding into Latin America. They're expanding into Eastern Europe. They're expanding into former Warsaw Pact countries, former buffer states, former Soviet satellites. So you've got $1.2 trillion in spending on NATO. You've got 13 countries are taken over in the span of 20 years. And you're Russia,
taken
and Russia
over.
spends 67
He's doing what
billion,
Mershimer does, framing what NATO does as aggression.
Less than a tenth of what NATO is spending. And the West paints Russia as the aggressor. NATO is coming to their doorstep. They've got the Baltics. They've got all these countries. Russia says a red line is Ukraine, and they say that's not good enough. We're taking Ukraine too. And of course, understand what that entails is, and you won't. I haven't heard you acknowledge this. What about Russia's legitimate security concerns about not Ukraine's safety, but NATO missiles in Ukraine? And you could say that's defensive, but everybody knows there's no such thing as a so-called defensive capability. The platforms that are used for an ABM
Not for Russia,
can be used for an ICBM. The missiles, we're talking about theater support missiles, which are conventional, they could be easily equipped with nuclear warheads. They're talking about a alliance which express purpose is to contain Russia, deploying ABM, surface-to-surface missiles, forward deploying a base in Ukraine, in the Black Sea, in order to project power explicitly against Moscow and against the Caucasus region and through the Black Sea. And NATO is vastly more powerful than Russia. So the idea, and then this undermines the whole idea, if Russia is this revanchist state, nobody in their right mind on the West or the East thinks that Russia is even going to be able to occupy Ukraine, let alone rebuild their empire. You talk about all of Central Asia, the Baltic states, the Warsaw Pact countries, forget about it. They won't even be able to occupy all of Ukraine in the foreseeable future. They're having difficulty even winning Ukraine in a short amount of time. So the idea that Russia poses this threat, they're going to roll into Poland or something, that the aggression must be contained, it's laughable. 67 billion against 1.2 trillion, and everybody's pointing the finger and saying, Russia must be contained at any cost. I think it says that America's rule is innocuous and benign, and that's not the case. It says that NATO's expansion is innocuous and not threatening. That's clearly not the case, and the numbers itself speak to this.
We can talk about the numbers, but
woo, that was a great boss. I thought the problem was I was doing too little damage to it. That my weapon just didn't do enough damage. It just has a huge hit pool and naturally high armor, which is great. That's a great boss fight. Okay, it felt really random when I first did it, but again, that's like the good part of these games, right? Where like if it feels bullshit, it usually just means you need more practice. Yeah. What was I going to say? Oh, yeah, so, okay. So, obviously, Nick Fuentes isn't posing any real arguments here. No matter how badly people like him try to frame it, the fact remains that NATO is imposing no aggression whatsoever upon Russia, and Russia is imposing aggression upon countries in its vicinity. There is no getting around that at all. That's why they always try to frame NATO's expansion as a takeover, like an expansionist takeover. But again, no matter what they try to say, NATO is not an empire. It is simply a treaty. That's it. It is a treaty. It is a treaty organization, hence the TO in NATO. NATO does not give countries orders as vassal states. It's simply a mutual obligation for defense, which means that as long as nobody attacks NATO, it should be fine. Nobody has attacked Russia. Guys, when was the last time a Western power attacked or invaded Russia? Do you guys know? World War II. And it was Nazi Germany, the country they had previously allied with. Since then, the entirety of modern warfare has been defined by the fact that America and Russia, or Russia and any nuclear-capable country, cannot engage in direct warfare. The entirety of modern military theory is built around mutually assured destruction. There is no threat of an invasion on Russia. None. It does not matter how many missile platforms we build close to them. It will not happen. It cannot happen. The only reason Russia cares about the countries near it going to NATO is because it means that they can no longer militarily bully these countries into staying part of their political bloc. That is it. Russia feels bullied because it feels entitled to attack the countries in its vicinity. There is no other thing, there's nothing else to this at all. It's a very simple situation, honestly.
But, I mean, like, you can keep saying 1 trillion to 60 billion all you want. How many times has NATO invaded Russia? How many times has NATO threatened aggression towards Russia? Like, it hasn't happened. And, you know, we can talk about security interests. You know, it's funny you mentioned the ABM missile platforms and everything. An ABM missile platform cannot fire an ICBM. The anti-ballistic missile platforms that we installed in Poland, you can look at me all you want, but Biden himself literally invited Russian inspectors to come in and inspect these things. Just because it's a tube in the ground doesn't mean that you can just as easily throw a different type of missile, an ICBM, in there. There's a whole different apparatus. There's a whole different hardware requirement for firing these missiles. There's a whole different software requirement for firing these missiles. Tubes in the ground are not just things you can stick whatever missile you want in and happen to fire nuclear warheads out of. It just doesn't work that way. And again, Biden's invitation of Russia to inspect these platforms, I think, proves just as much as that. When we talk about how there's pressure from Washington or pressure from the West on what could be Ukraine's economy, we talk about threatening their sovereignty. Just the comparison is just totally unfair. If Ukraine chooses to be pressured by joining those types of free trade agreements, by joining those types of NATO alliances, I feel like that mounts the pressure onto you then to answer. If there is so much pressure from Washington militarily, if there's so much pressure from Brussels economically, if there's so much pressure from all these Western institutions, why is Ukraine so eager to join them? Clearly, there must be mounting pressure in the opposite direction as well, right? And we're comparing on the Western hand, like the ability to join these free trade agreements, and then on the Eastern hand, the forcible entry into customs unions that would heavily restrict your trade because now you've got shared external tariffs and everything. The idea that there is some like massive pressure from the West that threatens your sovereignty in a way that there isn't from the East, when Ukraine seems to be like eagerly trying to join the West, just doesn't make sense. Why? Like, their actions and the desire of their population just doesn't seem to speak to that idea that there's so much horrible pressure from the West. Something else that I also disagree with, and then you're going to answer this, because all of this keeps getting framed. Now, I said initially, I'll agree with all of that, and then I'll ask you a question about Ukraine. But
okay. So, by the way, I just want to say, I think that rhetorically, Destiny is holding it the fuck down right now. Obviously, he came prepared in terms of, like, the info that he has for this convo, but I expect that. I would be very disappointed if he didn't. In terms of the approach, the strategy, one thing that he's doing, and I know this because I've seen his previous debates with Fuentes, is that he's maintaining a posture of good faith, but he is also doing what he can to gish gallop and not allow himself to be gish galloped. Fuentes is, of course, not a good faith actor. At all. You know, we all know that. Clearly. Destiny isn't like ceding ground. He's not being shy about talking for a long time and throwing a bunch of points out there. Nor should he. There is no reason to engage in good faith with Fuentes. None whatsoever. So I think that's good strategizing on his part. I think it's respectable.
But now I want to challenge the framing of one of these things. We talk about vital security interests. I don't buy...
Oh, sorry, one last thing. If I had to guess... My guess is that Fuentes came into this wanting it to be like a meme fest, like Bloodsports. Like, he would call Destiny a cuck and a pedophile, and then Destiny would call him a Nazi, and like so on, right? Because, like, that's what Fuentes likes. And I think Destiny knew that as well. So what Destiny has done instead is, because he has a moderator and thus can abuse the format, he came in with a like 5-minute slam dunk of an opening statement, which instantly reframes the conversation massively and makes Fuentes look really, really, really dumb if he responds to that with like blood sporting, you know? So by speaking first, and he still could have done this if he had spoken first, but I think speaking first definitely helps. By speaking first, he had the ability to set the tone of the conversation. And in so doing, he's kind of put Fuentes on the back foot here.
By it. I don't agree with it. I've seen you talk about the funnel. I've seen other people talk about geography. Historically, Russia's been invaded a number of times through Ukraine. But like, I have to ask you honestly, if Ukraine was to join NATO, do we really think that there are going to be troops invading Russia? Does Putin really think that Ukraine's ascension into NATO means there's going to be some sort of ground invasion or some sort of like threat of force from NATO into Russia? I'm a ground
invasionist.
Like, if so, it hasn't happened in the Baltics yet. We haven't seen it anywhere else. Like, what, like, is there, I disagree that there is an actual security interest in Ukraine. I think that the interest lies more in the rebuilding of the empire and more of Putin establishing his order farther out from Moscow.
Yeah, I mean, I would just say that this is just, it's sort of almost a willfully ignorant position. And I understand if you like guzzle State Department propaganda, I understand why you might say like, well, how could NATO possibly pose a threat to Russia? It says it right here. It's a defensive alliance. You know, once again, the purpose of NATO, and I don't understand why you refuse to acknowledge this. The purpose of NATO is to contain Russia, and contain means we want to stop Russia. We want to prevent the influence of Russia. You know, that's a hostile action. Okay, and we're aimed at creating a sort of circle around Russia. We want to contain, that's what NATO is for. And NATO is more than 10-1.
So, no. NATO is not making an effort to encircle Russia. Russia is the largest country on the planet by a massive margin. As I understand it, NATO has not been reaching out to, like, Mongolia, to my knowledge, to try to form the fucking surround. This isn't a fucking castle siege of the world's largest castle. Of a castle that could be seen not just from space, but from the moon. No. NATO, notice how the framing that Fuentes is providing here is one where saying you are going to defend yourself against invasion is the same as aggressing against the country that's threatening to invade you. You guys all saw that, right? Like, what is a defensive alliance but a promise to attack? Well, attack if what? If attacked, you know? Yeah.
More powerful than Russia. And so NATO then moving into the Black Sea, moving into Crimea, moving into Ukraine, 100 kilometers from Moscow, just by its very existence, this presents a security threat to Russia. You could say all you want, well, I can't imagine a scenario. Well, American leaders talk about this stuff all the time. I mean, ever since the Russian incursion into Crimea and their support for the Donbass, we hear from American leaders, they say Putin's a killer, Putin's a thug, Putin's a dictator. We know that it is the wet dream of the neocons and of the Council on Foreign Relations and the State Department to depose Putin. This is why Western, Western agencies back Putin's opponents, like Navalny and some of the opposition parties. We know that this is what America does. They spy on Russia. We know that we back the anti-Putin resistance. It's the wet dream of the United States to have a color revolution in Russia, just like they had in Ukraine, just like that in Georgia, just like that in Kazakhstan. And so the idea that we can't possibly fathom a scenario where Russia would be threatened.
He's using the term color revolution.
More than 10-1. That'd be like if I went outside your house with a tank and a nuclear bomb and a light machine gun, and I came there and said, I fucking hate Destiny. I was like, but don't worry, I'm just here.
Threat implies attack, Vaush. Do these people really think Ukraine would attack? No, Nick Fuentes doesn't believe that. He is dishonest. If he actually felt that they would attack, then he would just flat out say that. What he's saying instead is, well, you know, the neocons, well, you know what a threat is like. No serious political analyst on Earth would ever claim that NATO has any plan to invade Russia. It is simply not the case. The only kind of military aggression that could ever fathomably be conducted against Russia in the world's current state would be some kind of, like, backing an insurrectionist coup. But you don't need to share a border with Russia to do that. You can do that from anywhere. That's not the same as a land invasion. So it just doesn't apply. It's meaningless. And I don't think that'll happen either.
Here to protect like your neighbors or something, and you're like, oh, well, he said it's defensive. That's okay. You know, again, you have to look at the history here of the Cold War. The antagonism between the West and the East doesn't evaporate overnight. And certainly, you know, once again, NATO's founding purpose contained Russia, and then it expands to Russia's borders, and to say like, oh, it's, you know, Russia has nothing to worry about here. It's just a refusal to acknowledge the Russian perspective. And this is where America's got its blinders on. It cannot see its own culpability. It has no ability for introspection and to say, you know, what is our role in the crisis?
I just realized something. Dude, Nick is such a fucking retard. If he had just, like, been a tanky from the beginning, he would probably still be on YouTube and shit. What, like, he gets to be a fascist either way. Don't say Israeli or Jewish. Say Zionist. Don't say JQ. Say, like, you know, State Department. And then have every other position be exactly the same, you know? Don't say homosexuality is degenerate. Say it's bourgeois, you know? Ooh, if he wanted to continue being against interracial relationships, he could do the woke thing and talk about, he could do like the black separatist thing and say how he's suspicious of the ways in which white relationships with black people, like, coerce black people into abandoning their culture, you know? Like, he could do like the like Nick Cannon like thing about how like black people making compromises culturally. Dude, this would have been so much smarter. Holy shit. He would have been able to have, like, all the same positions. Okay, but Holocaust, though? Simple. Never actually directly defend Hitler, the Nazis, or deny the Holocaust. Only when asked about it or bring it up, gesture vaguely at, like, the bombing of Dresden, or, like, the nuclear bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and talk about all the war propaganda from World War II, and say, you know, honestly, with the State Department being as it is, who knows what they'll lie about, and just keep it at that. Unironically, he would have been so much more, durable. He would have been able to resist. Fuck.
You know, are we enhancing you again? The question: are we enhancing Ukraine's security at the expense of Russia? I mean, the answer is undoubtedly yes. And again, you could. The thing about the ABMs is just not true. The ABM platforms can be converted into platforms that can launch offensive missiles in a matter of weeks. I mean, this is just, and you can look into this. I'm not a military expert, but this is what the experts say. The ABM shield, we all know defensive capabilities can become offensive capabilities in a matter of weeks. They do have to be converted, but the hardware is there. And I would even get to some of the treaties, and this is something I didn't get into in my opening statement, and I really want to talk about the missiles. I want to hear your take on this. In 2001, the United States pulls out of the Anti-Ballistic Missile Treaty, which was signed under Nixon. And for people that don't know, you know, the United States and the Soviet Union agree we're not going to build anti-ballistic missile systems because it undermines mutually assured destruction. If a country is creating a shield where ICBMs may not be effective, this is going to only cause an arms race where countries will want to stockpile massive amounts of missiles and nuclear warheads, because if they got to go through a shield, then they're going to need twice as many missiles. So the Soviet Union and the United States agree, okay, no ballistic missile shield, you know, shooting down missiles is not part of our doctrine anyway, because this would incentivize an arms race. Well, in 2001, the United States pulls out of the treaty and says, you know what, we're going to build an anti-ballistic missile shield. And they say, well, oh, don't worry, Russia, that's because of Iran. And so they start implementing this ABM shield, again, which undermines mutually assured destruction. Russia can't invest in this. ABM is very expensive and very complex. Russia does not have the capability. So what we're talking about here is the United States pursuing technology that would, in a it's very difficult, and it's not, they're nowhere close to this, but it's the threat of it, create a system where they could potentially do a first strike against Russia and Russia could not retaliate. Undermines mutually assured destruction. Shield. Again, in 2019, under Trump, the U.S. suspends its treaty obligations to the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty. They change American military doctrine and say that now surface-to-surface short and medium-range ballistic missiles are part of their military doctrine in Eastern Europe. So we're talking about potentially, theoretically, in a military engagement with Russia, launching surface-to-surface missiles from Eastern Europe into Russia. And Russia says, hey, you know, what's going on? You're suspending the ABM shield. Now we need to invest in hypersonic gliders and hypersonic missiles, you're undermining mutually assured destruction. In 2019, Russia says you're hang on, this last point, and then because I'm going a little long, then I'll let you respond. You know, Russia says, hey, you're redeploying missiles to Europe. He says, you know, why don't we just ban? He says, let's put a moratorium on all the missiles, because you know what's going to happen is if you shoot a missile against us, we don't know if it's nuclear or conventional, and until it lands. So, I mean, that's something called warhead ambiguity. We would have to respond with a nuclear strike if we see a missile coming our way. The United States refuses to negotiate, and the United States pulled out of the treaty first. So, you say, how could they possibly be threatened? It's like, okay, well, NATO's expanding. Its purpose is to contain. The missiles are coming with it. The bases are coming with it. They're pulling out of the EBM treaty. They're pulling out of the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty. It's like...
I have a new political program. Guys, we should nuke Russia. Fuck it. It's all anyone can talk about anyway. Let's just get it over with. It's like ripping a Band-Aid off. Okay? It's gonna happen anyway. Just do it. Just do it. With how the Russian military has been faring in Ukraine, I'm pretty sure like 99% of their warheads are either non-functioning, or would just the fucking missiles would blow up in the in their silos, you know? What are these creepy hand things? Aren't they awesome? They're great enemies. They're super cool to fight. Let's do it. It's time. Bro, do you want to never return to Twitch? Twitch will only get mad if I say Glass Israel, not Glass Russia, for reasons. I think it's a good idea. Even neutral countries would die from the nuclear winter? No. No, they wouldn't. No elaboration. No, they wouldn't. Do you honestly think humanity would go extinct? Wait, don't take me seriously. I'm kidding with the fucking... Jesus. Okay, for what it's worth, in reality, it seems like a full nuclear war would not be the end of the world. For a couple of reasons, allow me to elaborate, okay? I think Adam something did a post on this a while ago that I didn't believe, so I looked into it a little more, okay? As I understand it, first of all, many nukes have been decommissioned since the height of the Cold War, meaning that our nuclear capacity is not as great as it used to be. A lot of the nukes that we decommissioned were the enormous strategic nukes, the ones that actually would end the world. Again, there are two types of nuclear weapons, okay? Do the laugh. Tactical and strategic, okay? Tactical nuclear weapons are used militarily. They're used like if there's a military base or like an enemy fortification that you want to turn into dust. You use a tactical nuke. They're not as large. They're still large enough to just vaporize like portions of cities, you know. And then you have strategic nukes, which were built to be used against general populations, like Tsar-Bama. A strategic nuke makes cities disappear. Sometimes more than a city. They're large. We decommissioned a lot of our, not all, but a lot of our strategic nuclear weapons, and additionally, the total number of warheads we have is not the same thing as the number of missiles we'd be able to launch. See, modern nuclear weapons require tritium, which has a pretty short half-life and needs to be replaced and maintained. The majority of nuclear warheads at any given point in time are in laboratories somewhere. They're in maintenance. They're sitting, like, elsewhere. They're not sitting at the cap of a missile. Meaning that if a sudden nuclear exchange were to happen, only the currently available nuclear weapons would be able to be deployed. Now, there is no information on how many nukes a country has ready to fire at any given point in time, because, as you can imagine, that is very much a, like, national secret, you know? That's like a national security thing. But my guess would be that even though there are around 10,000 nuclear weapons, 10,000 nuclear warheads on Earth, a full nuclear exchange would probably involve about 600 to 800 nuclear warheads being exchanged, of which most would be tactical, not strategic. This would be ruinous to the world and would bring about an era of misery unprecedented in human history, but I don't think it would literally end humanity. I do think that however long it took, humanity would be able to rebuild. Does anyone in chat disagree with what I've said? I think that's the case. From what I've read, like, assuming, you know, assuming everything that seems to be public at the moment, it would be like major cities would be annihilated, mass global starvation, radiation poisoning, everything, but humanity as a species could survive. Okay.
You know, again, does the United States have no ability to look and see, gee, am I the problem here?
So,
but I'll let you respond.
The ABM treaty is garbage. Why would you want to be part of a treaty where only Russia and the United States are signed onto it? What about China? What about the Democratic People's Republic of North Korea? What about Iran? What about any other rogue state in the world that might obtain nuclear weapons? So this might come down to a disagreement on the matter of facts, and I maybe we just disagree on this, but my understanding is that nuclear weapons, ICBMs, are relatively sophisticated in terms of how they launch and the deployment systems for the nuclear warheads. You can put MIRVs on these things. A single missile can fire off like 100 different warheads, some which might be nuclear, some which might be dummy, that there are thousands of these things on both sides. I don't believe that anybody believes that anybody on the Russian or U.S. side has anywhere near the capability right now to stop a legitimate second strike threat from any country. That if either side launches a nuke, everything's going into the air, and there is no shot that across the entire geography of the United States we have the capability to stop not only whatever weapons are shot from Russia, but whatever pops out of the ocean, whatever pops out of the Pacific and Atlantic, whatever comes by plane. There's no reliable way right now to stop. Like, Russia's second strike capabilities have not been threatened. And my understanding is that the ABM treaty is seen as kind of bullshit for the same reasons why some of the climate accords are seen as kind of bullshit. The United States doesn't want to necessarily play climate games when people like India or China have so many exemptions from these same things. Same thing with the ABM treaties. Like, that's great that the United States and Russia might come to some agreement, but I don't know what North Korea is doing. I don't know what Iran is doing. I don't know if I want to hamper my own abilities to deter a nuclear threat from one of these smaller states. I don't believe that Russia's nuclear capabilities have been compromised. And I'm pretty confident in saying that, because if they were, I feel like Putin would be screaming that from the rooftops every single day. I think that would be the first thing out of his mouth every time he talks. Because for however much I might hate Russia and however much I might hate nuclear weapons, some level of mutually assured destruction is probably good in maintaining some level of peace between countries. You nod your head, but I mean, Ukraine probably felt that way too before they deposed of their nuclear arms, and then Russia invaded them when they no longer had the ability to defend themselves from another nuclear power from invasion. In terms of like being afraid of a color revolution, I mean, now we've gone from we're worried that the United States might lead a NATO invasion from Ukraine into Russia into what are usually the liberal arguments of, well, if Russia sees a thriving, happy democracy on its border that's more west-facing, maybe the people in Russia are going to be really upset and they're going to revolt and there's going to be issues there. That doesn't seem to be a good argument for Russia.
What's a color revolution? A color revolution is a term that fascists use, particularly tankies. When people in a country are upset about something, but you want to ignore them. You want to say, like, it's all fake and made up. A color revolution basically means revolution, but don't pay attention to it. But revolution, but actually we're against people's revolutions now. It's all fake. It's CIA. It's fake. It's CIA. It's made up. It's not real. That's all it means. It doesn't mean anything.
Invading Ukraine because they're so scared that some successful country on their border might, instigate some revolution on their own borders, unless I guess we want to take this step further and say it's all like CIA coup, CIA operatives on the ground, fomenting distrust in the government. I don't think that's a good argument for them being able to invade Ukraine. Backing up, I have to ask, because you keep mentioning and you keep repeating these points about NATO is an aggressive alliance, NATO is encircling Russia. When has NATO taken aggressive action against Russia? And if these ABM platforms are so threatening, why is it that I think just last in February, Biden is literally he's welcoming Putin to come and inspect these platforms. Of course, he wants to be able to inspect platforms in Russia as well. Why would we allow them to do that if the tech is so easy to swap out? You say that it can happen in a matter of weeks. I mean, Russia surveillance will catch that. It's not like you're going to be moving this stuff around and changing up these platforms entirely without anybody seeing that happening. Surveillance is where it is right now in 2022. What is the threat that NATO represents to Russia? What is the threat? What is the perceived security risk aside from Russia not being able to invade partnering countries?
Yeah, so I've never said that NATO, it's a NATO invasion in Russia that's going to happen, or NATO. I didn't say it's an aggressive alliance. I said that the founding purpose.
Did he not explicitly say those things directly? Sorry, pardon, I am playing a video game. Did he not directly say those things? Yeah. Okay, yeah. Where the fuck was the entrance to the Volcano Manor? Nick needs to blow his nose. He's just naturally a nasally guy. That's why Nick hates people with big noses, okay? It's because he has naturally small nostrils, and it's why he's so nasally. This
of NATO is to contain Russia. So it's not like this is just an alliance like la-di-da, you know, we all want to have safety and security. It's like, no, we are shoring up these countries against Russia. Russia cannot join NATO. You know, NATO would not permit Russia to join. It's, you know, wouldn't that be great for world security if the United States and Russia were in an alliance? I mean, that would probably be the best thing for world peace. But Russia is precluded from joining because NATO...
Not a really good nose joke, TBH. Wait, I thought that was good. I thought that was good. I thought that was like a solid... I thought that was good. No, it wasn't. I liked it. It was great. Thank you. Someone thinks it was great. Someone likes me. I'm Jewish. It was fine with it. It was a tough landing. I thought it was good. Okay. All right. Okay. Cancel culture. You implied Jews actually have big noses in it? No, well, it would, in Nick Fuentes' mind they do, right? So, like, in his mind, like, he'll latch on to any trope or stereotype, you know? I could have said, like, that's why Nick hates people who he thinks have big noses, but that seems like it kind of chokes the joke out a little bit, you know? I don't know. Also, maybe I'm just biased on this, because, again, in the neighborhood that I grew up, which was full of Persian Jews... They did all have big noses, and they talked about it all the time and made jokes about it, and now that I'm older, I think big noses are really cute, so I don't know. Alright, whatever, weird champ me.
It was an anti-Russian alliance, and you could just as easily say Russia...
Anti-Semite. You people are gonna make me mad, okay? Yeah, why are you guys so on edge? Is it because we're watching a prominent neo-Nazi? Y'all are being mean to me, okay? Non-Jews getting pissed at Vaush for Jewish joke. It's not even a joke at the expense of Jewish people. Oh my god. It's Iranian people tend to have larger noses. Isn't there a joke on Twitter? Oh, you're in cutscenes. Isn't there a joke on Twitter about that guy who was Mediterranean, who looked like a Greek god, but then he got rhinoplasty, and it made him look like a podcaster? Has anyone seen that joke? That went viral like 3 times. Where he got rhinoplasty, and it made him look more like, I guess, white or whatever, and like people were joking that he looked better before. I think it's just, isn't... Wait, am I off on this? Big noses, that's like a Mediterranean thing, right? Like Greek, Turkish... Like, the island of Cyprus, Iran, like, isn't that like a Mediterranean thing? Not necessarily? No. Italy as well? Yeah. Hello. I've seen you in the loading screens. Oh, we have the volume down. Volcano Manor, fascinating. Have you ever harbored doubts, burdens of grace, and the dogmatic ramblings of the finger? Oh god, they're a fucking anti-finger. Rise with us against the air tree. Join Volcano Manor, don't join. Is this a quest, or am I joining like a faction? If I join, do I fuck myself out of like future shit? It's a quest? Okay, gotcha. Your decision is most welcome. Belong to the Fanner. Drawing room, makes yourself comfortable. I am Tanith, proprietress of the house, and honored to have you. Hey, Shu. Drawing room key.
The drawing room. Use the key.
Drawing room to the hall. Okay.
Russia's never invaded a NATO country. Russia's never invaded a NATO country. Russia's never invaded a Western country. Never invaded the United States or anything like that. And yet there's this fear that they're going to invade. And the point is, you know, Russia's borders are not on the border of Germany, but NATO's borders are now on the border of Russia. And I've said this before. The mere numbers
Why is Germany the
itself
threshold
speak to
there?
the threat. You know, this is a counter-Russian alliance which outspends Russia 10-1, which is now on their border in the Black Sea, in Crimea. And you know, what's the security threat posed? How about an ABM shield? How about surface-to-surface ballistic missiles stationed all over Ukraine? Surface-to-surface missiles which can reach Russia in 5 minutes and are unstoppable and indistinguishable from a nuclear warhead. What's the potential risk? And, you know, again, a lot of this has to do with something called the security dilemma. It's not to say that, you know, because I'll grant you, it may seem outlandish. Oh, is NATO going to invade Russia? You know, probably not anytime soon. But it's like the job of Moscow and the job of the Russian
they are
going to
invade. He keeps
Russia
switching back and
If there
forth.
is this capability that NATO, with this, again, 10-1, massive military, far more sophisticated, and more stuff, and far outspends, and bigger population, if it's on their border, that in itself is a threat. That existence of all that concentrated power and that tripwire right on the border, it's a huge threat. And even, you know, going back to the ABM shield, I'll grant you, is there a legitimate...
Are big dicks Mediterranean? Don't Mediterranean people have big dicks? Isn't that true? Am I wrong on that? You doing this weapon now? I don't know, it's pretty cool. Yeah, it's the Bloodborne weapon! You can even aim it up and down? Ooh. That might be fun to play with. There's no evidence that race and dick size is related? No, it's, isn't it geography? Right? Because the average dick sizes of countries change. It's like a diet thing, I think. There are a couple of factors. I don't think it's been proven that it's inherently a race thing, just that it's No, there's no evidence? I guess I'd have to look at it. It doesn't really matter to me. I've got a nice dick. That's fine. You have medium roll? Well, we'll cut some of our clothing off to accommodate this. The big dick diet? Yeah, like if you're getting proper nutrition, right? Or like if your culture tends to eat more like meat versus fruit and veggies. I don't know if that's what causes it. I'm only saying that, like, it's possible that some stuff, especially growing up, can maybe determine little bits. Like height, right? Doesn't height, like, your height varies massively? So Vaush is saying soy makes your dick small? No. You have to unclog your dick like in the Pornhub ads. Yeah, listen, okay, as long as you do a juice cleanse once every week, your dick will remain unclogged, and it'll grow very big, okay? Very, very big. Here, I wanna play with this weapon. Hold on.
Reason for the United States to pull out of the ABM shield? Yeah, absolutely. You're right. China's not a part of it, and there are rogue states that are nuclearizing, so I understand what you're saying. But this does nothing for Russia, because... You know, now, and you're right, the ABM shield is far from working, right? It's very, we don't know how to shoot down ICBMs reliably yet. But the United States pulls out of the ABM treaty with no regard for how this affects Russian doctrine. Russia cannot spend on ABM. ABM is very expensive, it's very complex. They just don't have the means for that. And so when the United States says, like, we're going to create an ABM shield, oh, but don't worry, we're going to put it throughout Europe, and we're going to put it in Poland, and we're going to put it over here, which could theoretically, in a theoretical context, prevent Russia from doing a retaliatory strike. This is a very provocative thing towards Russia. You may say, oh, Russia's got nothing to worry about, but that's the American perspective. What about the Russian perspective, where it's like, gee, are they going to build an ABM shield and they will have the ability, even if the United States...
Keep in mind, like, Fuentes is still doing this jumping back and forth between, like, oh, I'm not saying that NATO would invade, and now he's saying, like, okay, well, these missile defense systems may be nowhere near finished, and, you know, but it may take weeks to convert these missile pads to something that can launch ICBMs, but they could launch these missiles, you know, so, like, yeah, so you do think they would invade.
Just had the perceived ability to strike Russia with impunity, that would be enough to present a security threat to Russia, which is the point. And so there's almost no consideration. It's like, oh, well, come on, they're not going to invade. Oh, come on, that's not a big deal. What about the Russian perspective? What about if you're Russia and you see missiles coming to Ukraine and you see the ABM shield pulled up and they're pulling out of the treaties and theater support missiles are now back on the table in Europe? And you say, well, why wouldn't Putin talk about this? He did. He did in 2021 in November. Putin in
Interesting,
2020, when the United States formally pulled out of the intermediate range nuclear treaty, Russia said, listen, I've got a proposal. Let's put a moratorium on all the missiles in Europe. The United States didn't respond. In November 2020, Putin reiterates, he said, I've even got a more detailed proposal, and we're going to inspect the sites, and you can inspect our sites, and it's a robust mechanism. No response. In December 2021, in a press conference, Putin comes and says,
Yes.
I don't know why the West isn't talking about my missile proposal. In January 11th, 12th, and 13th, the Geneva talks, they say, agree with us on missiles. Even the American security experts say that there's room for common ground, but they don't accede to the demands because, we don't negotiate with dictators. We will not be, held hostage by dictators. So it's like, what more can you do when they're deploying missiles that can strike Russia in 5 minutes on their border? And the purpose of the alliance is to contain Russia. Yeah, NATO never invaded Russia. Russia also never invaded NATO. But who's expanding on whose border with their missiles and military base? Who's got the defensive alliance?
So again, Russia is the one literally expanding militarily through conquest right now. The expansion NATO is doing is other countries asking directly to be a part of a defensive alliance.
Which is designed to fight Russia. It's not Russia.
Yeah, so I keep hearing this over and over again, and maybe what this is, we've hit rock bottom. We keep saying the purpose of the alliance is to contain Russia. Contain Russia from doing what? Invading their neighboring countries? Like, if Russia didn't engage in these actions, it shouldn't really matter. It's not like this is containing or trying to contain Russia in an economic sense, like we're cutting them off from trade deals,
ISACs,
or like we're trying to blockade their cruisers, or we're trying to compromise their ability to move anything throughout the world. Like, this isn't the case. We talk about like containing Russia, and it sounds like we're saying we don't want to contain Russia from invading countries on their border. That's just that explanation just defies logic to me.
I love
we talk about this idea that again, we're always framing this in the case of U.S. security interests versus Russian security interests. Is Ukrainian security interest just not at play here? Do we just not care about this? And Ukraine has a genuine security interest, and that they want themselves to be a sovereign country with the right to decide which alliances they will or will not join. And the idea that there might be NATO bases here in the future, that Biden is open to inspection, the idea that down the road maybe second strike capabilities are lost in Russia and now they just get nuked by the US because we can do so with impunity. Maybe that'll happen 30 years from now. So now today we need to take over Ukraine. I don't know. I totally don't buy that as a reason. I feel like you could use that same justification then for Russia to essentially invade anybody they want that's near their borders and isn't claimed up by NATO yet, which if is the case, then that's an even stronger argument for NATO expansion. Every NATO country feels like, well, holy shit, literally these 4 letters are the only thing that keep my country from being invaded by Putin. Damn, NATO membership sounds like a pretty good thing right now. I don't feel like you've established a credible threat to Russia. You keep mentioning like the surface-to-surface missiles that can reach Moscow in 5 minutes. I mean, like if we were in like the 50s, maybe this would matter that we've lost second strike capability because, oh no, the whole government is wiped out. Nobody even saw the missiles coming. But this isn't the case anymore. Continuity of government exists. There are submarines all over the world from every nuclear power that's capable of emerging in the Pacific or in the Atlantic and nuking, shooting God knows how many nuclear missiles at God knows how many targets if second strike is something that needs to happen. You're not losing second strike unless you have from Metal Gear Solid some crazy anti-ballistic shield where you yourself say the technology doesn't exist yet. We're nowhere near that yet. And yeah, the idea that surface-to-surface missiles might exist in some part of these NATO countries that are, again, open to inspection from Russian leaders, that this somehow justifies Russia invading these countries for hypothetical security interests in the future, I just don't think that argument is strong enough.
Hidden path.
Well, and here's the thing. Even if you think all my arguments are Russian propaganda, like the reason why, because I know the NATO side says, the security thing is just a pretext for Russian revanchism, and that's all propaganda. What would even give Russian propaganda credibility, if that's what this was, is the fact that nobody on the NATO side they won't even begin to acknowledge how Russia might have a legitimate security concern. Like, again, you just sort of hand wave away. So what? Maybe in 30 years, Russia can't retaliate. So what? Maybe they develop an ABM shield. So what? You have surface-to-surface missiles forward deployed in Ukraine. Like, big deal. That is a really big deal. That is a really big threat to Russia. And that NATO is formed to contain Russia. When we say contain, we mean we want to suffocate Russia. That's the goal of the NATO alliance. That's a goal now of NATO expansion, is to prevent Russia from influencing its neighbors, from, and by the way, that's just what great power politics is countries seek to influence their neighbors. It just so happens that the entire Western Hemisphere and Western Europe is the sphere of influence of the United States of America. And everybody knows full well that if Russia deployed the same capabilities to Cuba, if Cuba was in a defensive alliance, if Cuba joined the Warsaw Pact, if Russia deployed surface-to-surface missiles in Cuba, if they had a base in Cuba, everybody knows the United States would not tolerate it. Everybody knows the United States. And you could say, oh, well, Cuba's right and so on. But the foreign policy establishment in the United States would not tolerate it. They wouldn't, nobody would even dream of tolerating that. Anywhere in the Western Hemisphere. Not in Cuba, not in Venezuela, not in Bolivia, not in Nicaragua, nowhere. But we're able to shore up in Crimea. Crimea is historically Russian clay, okay? I mean, this is a 70-year fluke that Crimea belongs to the autonomous part of Ukraine. It's just nonsense. The idea that we'd have a NATO base in Crimea, it's just like unfathomable. This Russian security apparatus cannot allow that. I mean, they just can't in good conscience allow that kind of a security threat. And I mean, you won't even interact with that argument. It's like, well, I mean, it probably won't happen. Well, it's probably like not a big deal. Well, for the Russians, it clearly is. And the point is to say this, you know, in this stuff about like, oh, thriving democracy and, well, Ukraine chose, this stuff is really semantics. What we're talking about here is two great powers, two empires, and they're duking it out over formerly neutral ground. That's what it is. Ukraine is, you know, neutral, ostensibly somewhat under Russian influence. And I would say it truly is neutral because in 2004, right, you get Yushchenko. And Yanukovych wasn't this pro-Russian stooge that people make him out to be. You know, he tried to balance the West against Russia. He definitely leaned closer to Russia. Ukraine was truly a buffer neutral state, if not leaning slightly towards Russia, right? And the point is, you know, and maybe to get more fundamentally to the heart of the issue, why is there a conflict here in Ukraine? What caused this? We cannot acknowledge the fact that we have catalyzed this by trying to wrest control of Ukraine from Moscow. It's about two empires competing over a neutral state. And, you know, to say, oh, well, it's about democracy or this one or that one chose. It's got to do with missile placement. It's got to do with mutually assured destruction. It's got to do with all these things. And people will, again, acknowledge the Ukrainian security interest, the American security interest, but not the Russian. And, you know, I just don't, I'm not getting from you that you really understand what that means for the Russians. Like, I'm fully willing to concede, like, yeah, like I get why Ukraine wants to be part of NATO. I get why NATO wants Ukraine to be part of NATO. It's part of their policy of containment. But there's no willingness on the other side to...
So you'll notice by the, like right now, the past maybe 10 seconds of talking, nothing that Nick Fuentes is saying is incorrect. This whole, do you understand how it is against Russia's security interests? I understand how NATO wants this. I understand how Ukraine wants this. But do you understand why NATO would why Russia would disagree? Do you know what's missing from this argument? Morality. If you reduce this conflict down to, hey, all these different countries all want a thing, and they all want that thing, and they're different things, and that's just how it is, then you leave aside any moral considerations. In reality, of course, Nick Fuentes' positions here are informed by a moral bias towards fascism. A moral assessment would indicate that NATO's desire to expand and Ukraine's desire to prevent itself from being invaded are both more moral than Russia's desire to invade neighboring countries. But this is why what Mearsheimer does is essentially fascist apologism, because in a situation where one side is wrong and the other side is right, where one is the invader and the other is the victim of invasion, flattening everything down to geopolitical interests in which we've arbitrarily decided that you know, respecting Russia's like territorial and geopolitical sovereignty and interests is the best way to prevent future violence. Well, what you're essentially doing there is allowing the oppressor to avoid a moral question.
To say, you know, let's give Russia the benefit of the doubt. Maybe it is legitimate security concern to to erode mutually assured destruction, which has been in place for 40 years. Maybe this is antagonistic towards Russia to put surface-to-surface missiles, reintroduce where they were not in 19, reintroduce theater support missiles as the backbone of American military doctrine. Like, there's no willingness to say, like, gee, Russia maybe has legitimate opposition to that. It's like, oh, no, that's just all an excuse because Russia's evil and Russia wants to invade everybody. And it's like, that's belied by the fact that Russia is outspent more than 10 to 1 by the anti-Russian alliance.
We can keep bringing up the 10 to 1 spending. I don't think it's doing anything to building your argument. I can acknowledge that Russia, that Putin might perceive there to be a security interest. I can acknowledge that. Yeah, I can acknowledge that perception exists. And I say might because we both agree here that NATO has never made an aggressive move towards Russia. If there are
Russia's
conflicts,
never made an aggressive move towards NATO.
which is a good reason for Ukraine to join NATO so that they stop being fucked with by Russia. That's an argument for Ukraine joining NATO. But the fact that NATO can expand to include Ukraine, when we both agree that NATO doesn't attack Russia, I mean, like, we have special phone lines installed so when there's conflict in the Middle East, the US will literally call Russia and say, hey, you have any guys there? We don't want to blow your own people up accidentally. Like, we go out of our way right now to ensure that there isn't conflict between NATO and Russia. And even if I can acknowledge that there might be a perception on the Russian side that there might be a security interest here, that perception doesn't supersede Ukraine's right to self-determination. And if you want to take the boring realist analysis of this, that's fine, but you're not getting any normativity from that. You're not telling me whether Russia's decision is right or wrong or whether it's morally or whatever justified. You're just telling me that Russia will seek to basically annex whatever neighbor it can if it perceives there to be a security threat, which again is just a stronger argument for a more aggressive expansion of NATO. When you use a realist perspective on Russia's dealings with its neighbor, all you're doing is revitalizing the arguments for a NATO alliance. And that's really all that's happened. Returning to the beginning of my argument, you've got countries like Sweden and Finland that are looking to join NATO. Since 2014 and Russia's invasions of Crimea, you started to see active NATO military forces being deployed to places like Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania. I feel like all the realist perspective does here is give us an even stronger argument for why NATO needs to expand to include these Central Asian and Eastern European countries, because if they don't, then Russia's just going to seek to invade them.
Okay, but again, this belies the fact that NATO expanded first. I mean, so NATO expands to 13 countries over 20 years, to former Warsaw Pact countries, to former Russian states, to former Russian sphere of influence. Russia draws a red line and says you can't take Ukraine. Ukraine is so vitally strategically important, you can't take it. NATO says, well, yeah, we're expanding there anyway. Boo-hoo, that's too bad. And then Russia responds, and then you go, see?
Russia shouldn't get to dictate whether other countries enter a defensive alliance. Like, the language they use is just so telling, time and time again, this realist language, which, to his credit, Nick Fuentes is adopting, pretty effortlessly. They didn't take anything. They asked to join.
That justifies why we've been expanding for 20 years.
There's two huge...
That just proves...
Yeah,
hang on, I'll let you...
Yeah, you're right. Go ahead.
That just proves... It's like... But NATO expanded first. The United States pulled out of the ABM Treaty in 2001. They pulled out of the Intermediate Nuclear Forces Treaty in 19. They expanded to 13 countries before 2009. And then when Russia finally responds in 2014, a red line was crossed. And then NATO goes, see, that's why we're expanding. See, that just goes to show why you need NATO. It's like, and the point is, on the realist perspective, what is our foreign policy? What are we trying to do? Because, I mean, and to the point, getting back to the conflict which is ongoing in Ukraine, I don't like conflict. I don't like when people die in Ukraine. I don't like when Ukraine's destroyed. This is not in anybody's interest. This is not good for Ukraine, obviously. This is not good for America. This is not good for Russia. But what led us to this point? I fail to see why, because there was no imminent threat of a Russian invasion in Ukraine. The problem was that Zelensky was unwilling, or Poroshenko too, unwilling to give up Donbass, unwilling to give up Crimea, unwilling to give up their aspirations to NATO. And the reason that Ukraine was so emboldened is because NATO said, we got your back. Ukraine would never dare to stand up to Russia and poke them like they do, but they think that they've got NATO. They get to go to Congress and demand a no-fly zone. And it's like, so what is in realist terms, in terms of how states actually behave, not normatively, not how they ought to behave, but in terms of how we know states act and in terms of how we can expect states to act, expanding NATO to Ukraine, or even talking about that, is a provocative action. But we have done that ever since 2008. And that is what has led to the current crisis. And you could argue in a hypothetical timeline, does Russia invade Ukraine without the NATO aspirations? We can't know that. But we also can't, arrive at the situation without analyzing our own behavior and saying, how have our actions provoked Russia? Because, at the end of the day, we have to talk in terms of the tangible and the real. This is the real outcome, and it's really bad. And this is a failure, ultimately, of American policy. And you could point the blame at Russia, and, fold your arms and say, well, Russia's just evil, and, they're just doing evil things, and you have to blame Russia because they're evil, and so on. And, we have no culpability. But of course, in great power politics, yes, we have culpability. We're a global and a regional hegemon. So we do have to have some introspection and analyze how did our collective policy, how did our policy of collective security, Russian containment, did that play a role in provoking Russia to engage in a conflict where nobody wins? We have to look at it like that. And I think you'll find that these policies we're undertaking, it's naive to say that they're just so...
So this is another thing to pick up on with the realist language that's employed here. Nick Fuentes will insist that he's not making any normative claims, but the way he frames the conflict betrays a normative bias. That we're the one who provoked Russia into invasion instead of NATO being provoked to have Ukraine join, or Ukraine being provoked to join NATO by Russia's military aggression, and that's a much stronger case. If we're to talk about what countries should do to avoid creating conflict worldwide, the answer is pretty clear. Russia, stop doing fucking invasions. Also, chat, why the fuck are you guys so quiet? There are 5,000 people watching. Anyway, the normative bias is portrayed.
They're just so goody two-shoes in nature. Oh, Ukraine joining NATO, it's totally innocuous. It's totally above board. Don't criticize it. Like, oh, a country wants sovereignty and security. Who can blame them for that? It's like, well, look at the other side. It's a negotiation. Everybody's security interest is being paid attention to except for Russia. But Russia has guns, too. And in a realist world order, you have to pay attention to these things. Otherwise, you get a crisis.
I guess we are 9 hours in.
And then I want to say one thing. And then here's the other thing. Let's entertain a scenario where Ukraine joins NATO, because they're still pushing for it, even after the crisis in 2014. Let's say today, what's that?
Of course, yeah.
Yes. Let's say Ukraine becomes a NATO member state. Okay, whoop-de-doo. Well, guess what? Crimea is still formally occupied by Russia. Donbass and the civil war between Kiev and Donbass is still ongoing. So what happens then when the government in Kiev is at war with Russian-backed proxies in Donbass? As a consequence of Ukraine joining NATO, you now have a proxy war in Ukraine, a proxy civil war between Russian-backed separatists and a NATO member state. What's more, Kiev does not acknowledge the Russian annexation of Crimea. I mean, they do not accept this fact. So, now we're in a really bad security spot where, and you could say, oh, well, this would never happen because people would never do this. But I mean, of course, these things can happen. What happens if there's a war between Russia and Ukraine over Crimea? What happens when there's there's this ongoing proxy war between Russian-backed separatists in Donbass and Ukraine? And I've heard the argument people say,
why are people linking an article? What? Read this article, for fuck's sake. John Mearsheimer endorses a Hitler apologist and Holocaust revisionist. Yeah, I've heard he has some pretty weird opinions about Israel as well. Okay, thank you.
Zelensky says, well, NATO's defensive, so Article 5 obligations aren't invoked if we attack Russia or something. But as we know, the fog of war is thick, and as to who started which conflict, of course it would benefit the Ukrainians to say, oh, well, Russia attacked us, now we need to fold NATO response in Crimea. The point is, you don't need to be pro-Russian or pro-American. You don't need to be an expert to say that's a really fucked up situation. It is a bad situation to have a NATO member state with disputed territory in Crimea and a proxy civil war in Donbass. Like that is probably the biggest threat to World War III in the entire world. That's probably and so that American policymakers would seriously consider this in spite of what's going on. The moment that Russia invaded Crimea, the United States should have said, you know what, it's too complicated, we can't get involved. But even in 2021, they're saying, we're going to enhance our strategic partnership, Ukraine will become a part of NATO. It's like, we know that Russia's not giving up Crimea. We know that the thing in Donbass isn't going to be resolved anytime soon. So even if we achieved our aspirations, all this would do is create a situation, a powder keg, that could absolutely lead to World War III. Maybe the #1 cause of World War III if that were to happen.
Sure. So just to shoot down the last point very quickly, nations with contested territory can't join NATO. It would never be the case that we would admit Ukraine to join while there is contested territory, unless Ukraine was willing to cede that immediately to Russia. So that's completely off the table right there. In terms of Ukraine, oh man, there's so many arguments to go through. One of the very first thing, you talk about how like NATO expanded first. NATO was the aggressor first. I don't know if I necessarily agree with that. When I was searching through, in post-Cold War era conflict, right? What's happening in Europe? One of the first conflicts that happened was Russia supporting the breakaway state in Moldova during the Transnistria War. So Russia had already established a pattern of you find separatists, you fund them, you export a fuck ton of Russian passports, you get these people set up and established and they're on breakaway state, you send Russian peacekeeper troops there, and that's literally right on the Ukrainian border. So we've already got a map for what would happen in the future in South Ossetia, in Georgia, and then in what's happening now in Donbass and Ukraine. The idea that NATO is forcing Russia's hands here, when I think Russia has already had the blueprint for this exact type of action, I don't agree with that. I think that Russia has already...
Damn it, Destiny, stopping, right? There's nothing wrong with it. Again, the problem with Destiny is not that he's unintelligent. That has never been my criticism of the guy. He's a very, very, very smart person. He's also a fucking retard. Sometimes that's just how it is.
Already established that pattern of behavior. In terms of, I feel like everything else is repeating over and over again. I don't even like using the realist analysis. I think it's garbage. I don't think anybody even agrees with using realism to analyze foreign policies anymore. I know that you like to talk about, I think I called him Mearsheimer. Mearsheimer's analysis of like the state of security in 1990 and onwards from Europe. He's written a lot of essays about it. He wrote a huge one, like a 50-page paper in 1990 predicting the future state of security in Europe. It was garbage. It was horrible. His prediction that Europe would descend into constant anarchy, that countries like Japan and the United States would be looking to vie for interest here, that every country would be rearming because that's what realist countries do. It just totally and completely missed the mark. I don't think anybody takes those predictions seriously in terms of this is how countries will act. So I don't know if it's appropriate to go forward into the future when he's already failed to make successful predictions of what has really been a relatively peaceful period for 30 years in Europe, and then try to say that this frame of analysis is what we're going to use going forward when it comes to dealing with Ukraine and Russia. And then again, what's more, to reiterate for the 50 millionth time, all of these realist arguments, if we are to accept them, justifies NATO including Ukraine and being aggressive towards Russia just as much as it does Russia taking over Ukraine and I guess establishing security around its own borders. But again, I mean, I can ask you again, and I know that we'll kind of dance around again, like NATO has not shown itself to be aggressive towards Russia. The most and best you can possibly say is that there are surface-to-surface missile bases in some of these NATO countries, but I mean, what? Like honestly, do you really believe that NATO countries are going to start launching missiles into Moscow? Like, do you really believe that, or is this something you're worried 20 or 30 years from now? Or do you think that the investment into ABM technology is going to become so good that, at some point we did it, guys, we beat second strike capability, time to just nuke the hell out of Russia? That sounds fantastical to me. Now, maybe we can imagine a world where that happens, but I can't use that imaginary world to justify the invasion, destruction of civilian cities, and the takeover of a sovereign nation that exists today in the real world. That would be insane to me. That sort of...
That's very good. That was good from him. That was very good framing.
Of justification can be used for Russia to invade literally any neighbor that they could perceive in 30 years to be a threat because of technology that doesn't exist yet. I just think that's absolutely insane.
Yeah, so to address the first part, I mean, to say that backing the Moldovan separatists is a precursor to NATO expanding to 13 countries is just ridiculous. And as far as realism goes, what realism does is it's a frame for how we explain how states behave. That's what international relations theory seeks to do, is let's analyze and explain how states behave. Why do they do the things that they do? And what realism says is that the decisions of states and the way that states behave is based on something called the security dilemma. That fundamentally states seek security. They want to secure their border. They want to secure, they want to create offensive and defensive capabilities that protect them from their adversaries. Certainly, this explains the Russian policy. This realist framework of security and explaining Moscow's behavior in Ukraine absolutely explains. It said nothing to do with ideology, nothing to do with ideas, nothing to do with interconnected institutions. It's about the raw military capabilities of the NATO defensive alliance. And you say, oh, well, Mearsheimer's predictive.
So, if that's the case, then why wouldn't all the countries that have joined NATO, why wouldn't they have all themselves become like Russia and been like antagonistic and engaged in like expansionist warfare on their borders? Or alternatively, why did NATO decide to be expansionist and militarily aggressive instead of just joining NATO, which was actually posed like a few decades ago? The answer to this is that just because countries seek their own security doesn't mean they always do a good job seeking their own security. I think that Russia has royally fucked up. Like, saying that all countries... Sorry, NATO joining NATO? I mean, like, Russia joining NATO. Saying that all countries optimally pursue their own security is as stupid as saying that corporations always optimally pursue their own growth. Of course not. Nations make mistakes, and the people who lead those nations also make mistakes. Now, right now, it seems like Russia has fucked up royally. It has emboldened NATO's opposition to it. It has refused to peacekeep or like meaningfully be a part of Europe in the post-Cold War world. They refused to build the necessary trade and diplomatic alliances to secure peace in their region. They have fucked their own security. They are economically fucked. They are socially fucked. They are diplomatically fucked. They have driven themselves into a corner and are lashing out because of it. Now, this is Russia's problem, not mine. The fact that Russia does all of this while possessing the world's largest nuclear arsenal is my problem. It is not their behavior, which I consider to be my problem. It is their capacity for future bad behavior. Now, with all that being said, it could well be the case that given the fact that Russia is already pursuing aggressive and suboptimal strategies for its own security, it could well be the case that Russia is a legitimate global threat, and therefore that the opposition to Russia is in the geopolitical interest of countries all over the world. That's the kind of threat that nuclear war poses. It's of my opinion that Russia, even if they were able to invade Ukraine with no Western-backed resistance, they would then be up against Polish borders, and that would not be any safer a situation. In fact, that would actually be quite dangerous. At that point, Russia would pretty much be completely up in line against NATO countries, and Poland and Russia have a contentious history at best. That would be incredibly dangerous, unimaginably dangerous. So maybe the best thing that we can do is oppose Russia and have it break its own back in its attempt to engage in imperialism, and in so doing, sort of force them into a less destructive geopolitical strategy. Does that make sense? Now, everything that I just described is workable within a realist framework. If you genuinely believe that all countries simply pursue their own strategic interests, their own security, then the idea that the rest of the world would work together to try to break Russia's back in Ukraine so they no longer engage in the behavior they're engaging in now, yeah, sometimes you just gotta let the child touch the stove. Exactly. Precisely. Sometimes that's just the best option you can field, you know? Sometimes that's the best you can do.
Analysis didn't work in the 90s. Well, it absolutely worked in 2014. In 2014, he'd had it down to a T. He predicted the next 8 years of conflict based on the realist interpretation of how states behave. He said, and he said this in 14. He said, Moscow will never accept Ukraine joining NATO. He said Moscow would sooner destroy Ukraine than have Ukraine join NATO. He said it's unacceptable, and this is true. This has been reiterated by Russia, by Putin, and This has been their policy for the past 8 years.
It's not that hard of a
As far
prediction
as,
to say that Russia
Ukraine
is
becoming a
insanely
NATO member state,
anti-NATO.
well, that's just off the table because of disputed territory. It's like, yeah, that's kind of the problem, isn't it? That's kind of the problem, that Russia came in there and said, look, I'm taking this off the table. I'm going to create disputed territory to take NATO membership off the table. And NATO persists. And NATO says, no, we don't even care. It's like, okay, so what's the end game then? If there's disputed...
Wait, what? At what point has NATO said that the contested territory within Ukraine is no longer something they'll factor into making their decision? At no point has NATO said they don't care about the contested territory. That's just completely made up. Completely made up.
Disputed territory, that's not being resolved anytime soon. Russia's not going to be dislodged from Crimea, and the war in Donbass goes on. So why is NATO membership being discussed? Why is the United States strengthening its security guarantee to Ukraine in November 2021, if that's the case? I agree with you. Yes, exactly. NATO membership cannot be expanded to countries with disputed territory.
It's simply not. NATO's position on accepting Ukraine has been consistent this entire time with no deviations. That it wants to have Ukraine in NATO at some time in the future. It cannot at the moment. That's it. That's the position they've held. It hasn't changed. It is the same thing.
Territory. And yet the conversation goes on 8 years into the civil war in Donbass, 8 years after the annexation of Crimea. So exactly, why is that conversation going on? It's a horrible nightmare scenario to imagine that Ukraine would become a NATO member state with these ongoing crises that have no sign of abating, yet it does. This is a horrifying thing. And then to the point of, well, oh, come on, NATO's never going to invade Russia. And this is the problem, I think, this is where your analysis fails. It's this naive worldview where it says like, oh, well, that'll never happen. Russia has nothing to worry about. It's like, okay. And yeah, Russia would never nuke the United States, right? Russia would never nuke the United States because that would be silly. I mean, that'd be crazy.
Might.
So we should just not have a nuclear arsenal. And, China would never invade the United, no countries will ever attack.
Retarded argument. The reason why Russia wouldn't nuke the United States is because the United States could follow it up with a second strike and it would end the world. The idea is that NATO would never attack Russia for the same reason, because it would prompt a second strike. But guys, do you guys want to know a secret? We can first strike Russia without NATO. We don't need to have Ukraine in NATO for us to be able to do a first strike. Having Ukraine be a part of NATO adds in the modern world exactly nothing to our ability to annihilate Russia without prompting the same retaliation that prevented us from doing so during the Cold War. It changes nothing. The idea that having Ukraine in NATO brings the world closer to nuclear oblivion is true only insofar as you believe Russia would use it as an excuse to end the world. Not because Russia suffers any additional threat. It just doesn't. It's not true.
Attack the United States because the United States, we have 300 million guns among the population. We've got a big enough military. So let's just close down all our military bases. Let's totally destroy our nuclear arsenal. Let's get rid of all that. It's like that flies in the face of, again, how states pursue security. It's about risk. It's about capability. It's about potential. If the United States has the capability to do a first strike on Russia,
we can. We already can.
Second strike with an ABM shield, that alone is an unacceptable security posture for Russia.
We already can. We can already do a first strike. We already have that power. We already possess that power. We already have it. And if we did have an ABM shield, if we did have the ability to deter nuclear retaliation, we could still first strike from our own borders. Ukraine's involvement has nothing to do with this. It's completely irrelevant. It's a complete misdirection.
I mean, how would you feel if you're a Russian citizen and it's like, well, I think the United States won't nuke me today. Like, that's just not good enough.
Can I ask a question? And then you can explain.
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah,
sure.
Let's
have
say I actually grant all of
ICBMs.
that. Let's say that an ABM shield exists and we have first strike.
Oh, he's going to say my point.
Totally nullified a second strike ability. Why does it matter if we have Ukraine then?
Yes.
Why can't all those missiles just come into the Baltics? What changes there? How far is the border from Latvia to Moscow?
Yes, we already have the Baltics. We already have Western Europe. We have nuclear submarines all over the world. Yes. Destiny.
You should ask the NATO then. I mean,
no
I'm
answer.
not the one that
Nothing.
wants-
No
I'm
answer.
asking you
Why
because
does
you're
it matter
telling
if we
me
have
that
Ukraine?
you're telling me that
Is
we
he a
need to
Vaush
keep
fan?
Ukraine.
He
out of
watched
NATO
this
because
stream,
I'm a
then
real-
debate
I'm
Nick
Russia, and I
Fuentes?
need to shore my security interests. Okay, well, let's say we've
We should do
eliminated.
neither of these things.
Well,
We should do-
no. You're describing how Russia acts. I'm just asking. Let's say this technology exists. Let's say the ABM, all our anti-ballistic missile platforms exist. We've eliminated second strike. Fuck, we could launch those missiles from fucking DC. Why would it matter at that point whether Ukraine is in
Because-
NATO or not? How does that security interest square up at all with Russia's invasion into Ukraine?
Because both pose a security risk to Russia. I mean, I don't understand. It's 6 of one, half
The
a dozen
same
of
risk.
the other.
It's the
But
same
both of
risk,
these things
unchanged.
are provocations because both upset the balance, and that's fundamentally what realism is about. Is about
He has
balance.
no answer.
So I'll answer your question.
He has no answer. This is very satisfying. Destiny brought this up at the right time. He brought it up at the same time that I would have. I'm gratified. Yeah, he has no answer to this. If Ukraine is a part of NATO and we armed Ukraine with nuclear weapons, we would be as capable of a first strike as we were before all that happened. It makes no change. There's no alteration whatsoever to our capacity. None. It doesn't matter if we have like fucking Jack Bauer nuke bombs planted in Moscow beforehand. All nuclear-powered countries these days, all countries with nuclear weapons, have the ability to launch a second strike even if their capital has been taken out. If America just got glassed in a nanosecond with no chance at retaliation, do you think our nuclear subs, upon hearing that, would just, like, sit there? Nope. Nope. Leaving aside the impossibility, by the way, of annihilating an entire country in no time whatsoever, those nuclear subs, if they got the sit rep, you know, if they surfaced, got the sit rep, you know, saw the smoking crater that used to be their country, yeah, they would fire. They know their job. They know what they're supposed to do. It doesn't matter. The idea that, so this may have made a little bit more sense back during the Cold War, back when the Cuban Missile Crisis, did we even have ICBMs back then, or were all missiles limited to like 2,000 or 3,000 miles? Not yet. I think at the time we didn't have ICBMs. Yeah, so no, we did have them. Here, wait, let me make sure. ICBM, so I know. When were they developed? The first ICBMs were deployed in the Soviet Union in 1958. The U.S. followed the next year, China 20 years later. I wonder what the range was of the initial missiles. 3.4 thousand miles. Early ICBMs had limited precision. Taxman's military targets. History, the Cold War. Soviet Union development, rocket development, ICBM research early on. Yeah, okay. They weren't long enough. Honest to God, I'm pretty sure that even back during the Cuban Missile Crisis, it also didn't matter back then. By the time the Cuban Missile Crisis had taken place, I'm pretty sure that having missiles in Turkey and in Cuba, like even when we took those missiles out, like we were still like we were still capable of like nuking the other side all around. I don't know. I could be off on that. The point is, nowadays it definitely doesn't matter.
Question, you know, creating an ABM shield, even though, and you don't even need to grant me that. It's that we're even working on it. You're right, because it's nowhere near completion. It's not effective, but it's that 20 years ago we said, forget it. You know, we're going to start to build this thing that Russia cannot build. It's a provocation. It upsets the balance. It upsets the confidence that Russia has, because that's really what it's about. Is you have
insecure
two
Russia
adversaries, which are both powerful and distrustful of one another. Is about confidence in each other. And when the United States pulls out of this treaty, it disrupts the confidence that Russia can have in mutually assured destruction. Their confidence that the United States will never do a first strike because it would get annihilated.
Because of North Korea and Iran, right?
Pursuing this tech, okay, but that does nothing for Russia. They could say that. I mean, they could say that, but the ABM shield works equally against Russian missiles as it does against Iranian North Korea. So, I mean, they could say that all day long. but the effective capability works equally against Russia.
It doesn't work equally, though, because you can only intercept so many missiles. That's why both countries have, like, people...
But they still shoot down missiles.
This is the question that, like, every high schooler asks, right? They're like, why are so many nukes in existence, Mom? We could nuke the whole world 50 million times over. Well, it's because you want to get through any of those hypothetical shields, right? A single ICBM can have a MIRV that has, like, what, like fucking 20, 30, 40 dummy warheads on it now? There's no possible way that you're intercepting thousands of these missiles, right? It's not like shooting down Palestinian bombs being lobbed into fucking Israel, right? These are pretty sophisticated weapons launching from all over the world. Some from
space.
The
Pacific, ICBMs, in place we don't ICBMs reach space, right?
But this is fundamentally misdirection because, and again, that is what the United States said. They said, well, we're building this ABM shield for Iran and North Korea. Okay, but ABM agreement was signed between Russia and the United States. And that was the foundation of mutually assured destruction between Russia and the United States for 30 years.
Signed before North Korea and
by the way,
had ICBMs.
Hang on. Let's not interrupt each other. We had a good back and forth here. That it still disrupts Russia's confidence in the mutually assured destruction framework. Because I will grant you all of that. I agree with you. ABM is inadequate because it doesn't include China. ABM is inadequate because you do have rogue states seeking a nuclear arsenal. All of that being said, this does nothing.
Hey guys, why does the realist framework presuppose a rational self-interest for all nations, but then they're constantly making apologies for Russia's irrational beliefs? Like, if you have a realist perspective where, all countries are just sort of pursuing their own security, why is, hey, Russia has an irrational fear of this, like a legitimate excuse? Like, how is that acceptable? If we're accepting irrational beliefs, like, within this purview, then we can justify fucking anything.
Nothing to reassure Russia. I mean, like, because just as Russia says that, NATO promised Gorbachev that NATO wouldn't expand, it doesn't mean shit if it's not on paper. So
that is true.
States saying we're doing this for Iran and China and North Korea, but effectively they're still building an ABM shield, and it still does disrupt the confidence that Russia has. And so it upsets the confidence and the balance as far as the nuclear question is concerned. And the same is true of Ukraine. You're right. Do I think that NATO's going to invade Russia anytime soon? I mean, probably not. I don't think that would make much sense, but it disrupts the balance and it destroys Russia's confidence that something like that could not happen. Again, it relies on NATO's good faith. And good faith is not enough because regimes change, circumstances change, crises flare up, things happen in the world. And so what underlies a nation's security is its capability, its confidence, and those things come from offensive and defensive capability. They come from buffer states. They come from treaties and agreements. And so it's not enough to say, well, NATO's never invaded us before. They probably won't, launch those missiles at us from Ukraine forever into the future. It's not an adequate guarantee. And that's the argument from the Russian side is it's just not good enough for Russian security. No one's listening to that.
If we go through the realist perspective, I'm curious. If NATO membership was never floated directly on the table to Ukraine, would not Ukraine fall victim to Russia's sphere of influence anyway? Isn't that what realism would tell us? That irrespective of NATO expansion, we would expect a country to exercise authority, if it can, onto weaker powers surrounding their borders, meaning that none of this NATO shit even really matters anyway to Russia?
Well, that's really the crux of it, isn't it? Yes.
It kind of is, right? Yeah.
Yes, well, but here. Yes, Russia would exert influence over Ukraine, and there's nothing wrong with that.
Well, okay. So then why talk about all the NATO bullshit, right? Obviously, they're going to do it anyway. And even security in the Black Sea, does it really matter if they have access to the Black Sea? They're not getting to the Mediterranean through fucking Turkey anyway, right? Where there are also, like, nuclear missiles as well. Like, it seems like all of the NATO shit is just like a smokescreen anyway, right?
No, but it's not. It's
not. It's not. No.
You're saying, like, oh, well, Ukraine would just be a buffer state. It's like, yeah, exactly. Ukraine should. NATO membership makes it a pro-Western country. Yes, it should. Because the worst case scenario of Ukraine being a buffer state is that Russia will influence it. Who cares? Yes,
people of Ukraine care, obviously.
Powerful states influence weaker states.
60,000
this is how
souls.
States behave.
That whip.
And that is...
This is not how all states behave. That's not true.
That is how great powers behave.
Why don't we invade Mexico,
you think the United States doesn't do this?
No,
because
the United States
need
doesn't.
to.
But we absolutely could.
Are you seriously arguing that the United States doesn't influence Western Hemisphere countries?
Influence is way different than right now. We have drug issues. We've got cartel issues that exist on our southern border. If we wanted to, dude, we could bomb
Now
the
you're just
fuck
being
out of
ridiculous.
Hold on,
Now you're
no.
just being
If we're
ridiculous.
taking the realist perspective,
He's
if a
back
country
on the
like
bombing
Mexico
Mexico
existed
memes.
on Russian borders, do you think that Russian would say, yeah, we understand a lot of illegal immigrants coming here. Yeah, we know a lot of it is ran by cartels, but, you know, we're going to respect your sovereignty. We're going to let you guys forget it. Do you think that Russia would take the same position towards Mexico as the United States would? Absolutely not.
Let me just get this clear. Your position is that in an analogous way, you know, in the sense that Russia influences Belarus and Ukraine, you're saying that the United States in that same way does not influence
Canada and
countries in the
Mexico?
Western Hemisphere.
Absolutely
Countries in the Western
not even
Hemisphere.
close.
I mean, like in South America, especially through the Cold War, yeah, you could probably
No,
make
I'm talking
arguments
about
for
today.
that.
I'm talking about today. They
Absolutely
don't-
not. Absolutely not. Will we recognize and support? Well, here I'm curious. Like, what? Educate me. I don't know much about South American history. What are like breakaway states that the United States has recognized and sent paramilitary groups to? And
Wait, how the fuck? Wait, hold on. Russia did a full fucking military invasion of Ukraine, and Belarus is a direct puppet state. How the fuck is that analogous to our relationship with Mexico and Canada? That's how do you line that up exactly? Like, of course, the United States influences countries all over the world, and we use a lot of economic coercion to do it. But we very rarely resort, these days, to direct military aggression or influence. Most of the time. Of course, we still do that broadly. But I do think there is a categorical difference between the type of imperialist aggression we've affected in the past few decades and what Russia is doing now.
in order to defend these states, where we shipped off tons of U.S. passports, where we've shipped off U.S. citizens in order to Americanize these places. Like, where has this happened in South America since the year 1991 that's comparable to what Russia has done in Georgia, in Transnistria, in Ukraine? Like, where are these things happening?
I mean, listen, if you're arguing that there's no Western influence in the Western Hemisphere...
I didn't argue that there's no
Never
Western
said that.
Hang on, don't interrupt me. I know, see, this is what you do. This is what you do.
Well, you're not answering my question.
It's
but go ahead.
happening.
I'll listen to
Finally.
you.
This is what you do. This
Finally.
is what you do. We're talking about a fundamental assertion here, which is how great powers act. And the fundamental assertion is, the United States influences weaker states. And then you get into, educate me about the history. You're not answering the question. You're not answering. I'm interrupting you. It's like, if your assertion, I don't need to back that up. I refuse to do it. I refuse to back it up because it's preposterous to suggest that the United States does not influence weaker states in the Western Hemisphere
I never said
or
that.
elsewhere in the world. Absolutely, they do.
Of course they do. Yeah.
How about in Colombia, where they backed a coup there? How about in countries?
Hold on, Destiny
we have
said
Guantanamo
after
Bay
the
in
Cold
Cuba
War.
against the interests of the Cubans. The idea that the United States does not influence states, that we bully them into the TPP, we bully them into all.
We
kinds
abandoned the
of things.
TPP because of our own citizens. Like, what do you mean?
Of course, we influence.
Do you think the
weaker
existence
states.
of Guantanamo Bay?
Wait. We
Yeah,
prevent
go ahead.
Japan from having a military. We station our troops in South Korea. We influence Saudi Arabia all the time. We influence all, Western Europe.
I'm pretty sure Japan could have a military
and so
today if
that's
they
where
wanted.
you're sort of living in unreality, is where you say Russia is the only country that behaves in this way. Russia cannot have a... And I think maybe this is the crux of the disagreement, is you think that, for Russia to have a sphere of influence over Ukraine, you literally say, well, we must do anything short of war to stop this Russian incursion. NATO membership must be on the table. All
Bat
to
baby.
prevent what?
Bat
Russia
baby rule.
having a reasonable sphere
All
of
to prevent what we're
influence.
talking about today. Do you think that
Over a country.
do you think that Japanese and South Korean citizens want the United States to leave in the same way that Ukrainian citizens want Russia to leave today? Do you think that's at all comparable?
Yeah, the Japanese,
Really?
yeah, absolutely.
Ooh.
But even in Ukraine, half the population is
You think the
pro-Russian.
Japanese who are begging for greater military...
Wait, half the population of Ukraine is pro-Russian? I would love to see whatever poll he's citing there. What the fuck? Maybe like, I don't know, 20 years ago or something. Probably not right now. Oh, okay. This lava barely hurts you. Oh, wow. Okay. I thought that would tear through me. Oh! I think that's my first level 7 stone. Maybe not. Still. Japan started rebuilding military power under Shinzo Abe a number of years ago, mostly defensive and short range. Yeah, I'm just saying, like, they could probably. Why are you fat rolling? Lava.
presence when North Korea is doing crazy shit, when China is sailing ships through
The
different
Japanese
seas.
want to
That you
rebuild their
think...
military.
You
and
really
certainly it is just as contentious in Japan as it is in Ukraine. Are you gonna? I mean, the people in
Wait, okay, pardon me if I'm wrong. We're not the one keeping Japan from rearming, right? It's a part of their constitution, but don't they have a process for amending their constitution? Like, if Japan if Japan was like, okay, let's decide on doing this. Do we want to do this? And they pushed for it politically. It's not like America would fucking invade Japan to like keep them. Yeah, we want them to have more of a military. We're fine with them having a military. They're our ally. That we would love it if they took some of the pressure off us in the Pacific region.
that wanted to join NATO wasn't even a majority. It was a plurality, not a majority, a plurality of people. So it wasn't even more than 50% in Ukraine. You act
the clause
like,
expired?
oh, it's this
Pause.
hostile thing. It wasn't hostile. And by the way, when Yanukovych accepted the Russian deal as
10-hour
opposed to the
stream.
EU deal, you could say, oh, well, they were going to be embargoed. No, they could not replace Russian trade. They're dependent on Russian trade.
Yeah, but, like,
These are
look
the
at what you're
kinds of
talking
soft power
there.
ways that Russia influences a state.
But look-
and by the way, half
Actually, Japan does kind of hate the American military base because they have to pay for them. Holy shit, is that true? Does Japan have to pay for our military bases? I didn't know that. That's so fucking based. Haha. It's like reverse rent. It's like they hired us for security, except they didn't have a choice. It's like reverse slavery. Like we're like forcing them to hire us for our fucking security. That's funny. I'm sorry. Shoulda won World War II, bitch. Hey, let's go. You are such a State Department jerk, Lamau. Fuck you. It's funny. How is this reverse slavery? Because under slavery, you force a person to work for you, and under this, we force them to hire us. Sorry. Okay, just keep going.
Ukrainian population supports Russia. Yanukovych was the most trusted politician in 2010, and he was democratically elected, and international monitors said, you know, this was a model for a democratic
in
election.
one election,
So,
yeah, not earlier,
in
but
2010,
yeah.
in 2010
he was, yes.
And so, well, you laugh at that, but the point is to say you're creating this false, you're creating this completely distorted reality where, oh, well, Ukraine doesn't want Russian influence and Japan wants
Man,
American
Destiny
influence.
can
It's like,
create
well, the
realities?
picture's
Holy
more
shit.
complicated than this. It's about how states behave. And, you know, Ukraine, some people in Ukraine want Russia, some people in Ukraine want the West. Russia influences Ukraine, as is how states behave. You could disagree, you know, well, that's not normative, that's not right. But Ukraine was a part of Russia for hundreds of years. Ukraine was governed by Russia for the past 100 years, even when it was administratively autonomous. And, you know, for Russia to have a sphere of influence, this is what the United States must tolerate for peace and détente with Russia. In the same way that nobody challenges America's influence in the Western Hemisphere or in Western Europe or elsewhere in the world, you know, and in these other countries. I mean,
Good
that's
to be on
just,
top.
you know, if you're going to disagree with that, I mean, you're just living in Candyland.
I mean, I to try to compare Russia's activities in Ukraine with the soft power that America exerts over the world, right? There's a reason why you're trying to say, like, well, South Korea and Japan, they feel the same way, right? Like I asked you to show me that in Japan, and you could show me a few protests in Osaka because of dumb Marines on base or whatever. But like the reality is that we know that military presence of the United States there is welcome far more than Ukrainians are welcoming military presence from Russia into Ukraine. Like I hate to use this word, but it's self-evident, right? And to pretend that realism versus, say, like constructivism is a better way to analyze how powers in the world work when we look at how the United States treats members on its border and we contrast that to how Russia treats members on its border, it obviously just, it's not a good way to analyze how countries behave, right? Russia
Yeah, the difference is, okay, that Japanese people had protests about American military bases, and there are videos right now on TikTok of Ukrainian women singing along to pop songs while stuffing gasoline-soaked beer bottles with styrofoam bits. That's the difference, okay? In terms of their respective opinions towards other countries' occupations, you know, one of them has protests, and in the other one, the Ukrainian government is telling all of their farmers that any armor they pick up from Russia with their tractors doesn't have to be taxed. That slight difference, you know?
has, as a constructivist would say, an iterative pattern of behavior with countries on its border. It's continued to act in such a way. And to say that Russia's hypothetical security concerns 30 years into the future justify the shelling of Ukrainian cities today, the destruction of Ukrainian cities, the murdering and the killing of Ukrainian civilians, that all of that is okay because Russia must have a sphere of influence. And when I ask why, it's because, well, so that NATO doesn't invade. And when I ask why, it's, well, because then Russia wouldn't be able to invade. I guess if we want to use a descriptive form of analysis, we can, but morally, normatively, what's right, I absolutely don't think that we should accept that a country like Ukraine has to cuck itself to Russia and become a vassal state just because of some hypothetical security concerns that Russia has because it can't play nice with the rest of the world.
See,
yeah,
but
I think we're kind of like looping back and forth now. You can
I think this is the crux of it. I really believe this is the crux of it because what underlies your whole worldview is this benign hegemon narrative. You know, you can call it constructivism, you can call it whatever you want, but it's this idea that, you know, when America exercises soft power, like, well, that's okay, and they want it. And when America exercises hard power, well, you know, it's justified or something. When Russia does it, well, you know, it's evil and they can't do it, and this is, you know, Ukraine's cucking themselves. It's like, this is how great powers behave. And let's take a look at NATO. You know, you say NATO's never been aggressive towards Russia. NATO's been aggressive towards other states. You know, you know this. I don't even have to say it. It's as you say, self-evident. The United States invaded Afghanistan. The United States invaded Iraq. They said there were weapons of mass destruction. There weren't. Why did the United States invade Iraq? Well, some would say, well, they invaded a foreign state. They genocided their population. They sought a weapon of mass destruction, et cetera, et cetera. You could say that they invaded Iraq because Saddam Hussein was a rogue actor. You know, they found the anthrax was BS. They were not harboring Al-Qaeda. They didn't have the WMDs. We invaded Iraq. In 2011, NATO did regime change in Libya because they said the elections weren't free and fair enough.
Among other reasons, but...
What were the other reasons?
Among torturing and imprisoning political prisoners, among using chemical weapons against it.
National sovereignty.
Yeah.
National sovereignty.
Well, there's some levels of national sovereignty that I guess we just don't accept. When you say
wait
America exercises soft power, and it's okay.
Wait. Is national sovereignty absolute or is it conditional?
It's obviously conditional on things like the Geneva Convention or international agreements, but also notice everything you said. Where has NATO exerted its power against? None of the countries that you mentioned were nuclear powers.
Doesn't matter.
In your world,
we're talking about how great states act.
Sure.
We're talking about normativity.
That's the opposite of normativity. It's descriptivity. But regardless, if we were to say that NATO should no longer expand, okay, that we're not going to do that anymore, what is the next stage? The next stage is every single non-aligned state in the world getting nuclear weapons. Is that the future that we want? The whole point of things like the Budapest Memorandum was we need less states to have nuclear weapons because the more people that have them, the more fucky things kind of get. So do we just say now that like, well, every non-aligned state in, in Southeastern Europe or in the Middle East or in Africa or in South America, everybody just start getting nukes because, hey, if you got them, even if we tell you to get rid of them and we won't hurt you like we did with the Budapest Memorandum, we're still going to hurt you, right? I don't think that's a stable future. I think that security situation is bad for everybody, Russia included.
Well, I'll address that in a sec, but I think that's a bit of a pivot, if you'll forgive me, because I want to explore this little. Because the crux of your argument is, well, Russia violated Ukraine's sovereignty, which is an unforgivable sin, but you just said that NATO's intervention in Libya was justified because national sovereignty is conditional. So which is it? Is sovereignty conditional or is it absolute?
I don't think that sovereignty is necessarily absolute. If it was the case that Ukraine was gassing its own citizens or committing horrible war crimes, I mean, there are forums that you can go through to exercise power against people that do that. You've got the United Nations, you've got NATO. There are organizations that can do that.
But who decides? Who decides?
I just said the United Nations or NATO. And the United
Nations. NATO decides. Well, that's very interesting, isn't it? So the NATO alliance, which is formed counter to Russia, they can decide when sovereignty is suspended or not. Russia, when Russia says we're going to invade Ukraine for our vital strategic interests, that's not a good enough reason.
NATO's not.
Sovereignty is airtight. Oh, Libya tortured some people? Fuck sovereignty. We can intervene. We can do whatever. Oh, Saddam Hussein is doing some wonky stuff. We can invade.
Libya is your worst example, okay? Because sometimes NATO goes in at least without. Sometimes NATO will go in without UN resolution. Libya was so fucked that Russia and China abstained from the vote. They're part of the Security Council. They got a UN resolution to go into Libya. That's how fucked Gaddafi was. If you want to use an example, no, that is exactly the point. It was so fucked that even they.
Wait, hold on. Wouldn't a realist argue then that our intervention in Libya is justified if even Russia and China aren't willing to contest it? if all realists care about is avoiding conflict by deferring to geopolitical powers what they want and like allowing countries to pursue their own security concerns to the extent that it doesn't worsen world conflict, like if apparently the Western world wanted to invade Libya, and apparently China and Russia weren't even willing to defend that point. So, okay, shouldn't we leave it to the side? It's almost like we're realist when it allows us to paint over the moral crimes of Russia, and in every other respect, we suddenly have normative concerns. Oh, whoops.
Even they wouldn't defend you there. The point is to say that there might be reasons.
Sovereignty is conditional. If it's conditional,
of course it's conditional. But what is
the
then it's about the terms?
But sure, it is about the terms. But the terms can't be that Russia is worried about a future hypothetical war. That's why I'm not just screaming at you over and over again. I'll get to that. I'm not screaming at you over and over and over again that Ukraine has sovereignty, and that's the only reason why they shouldn't be invaded, right? Russia doesn't have justification for invading Ukraine. The future hypothetical threats to Russian sovereignty can't be used as an invasion to another sovereign country that's not in violation of any UN resolution.
Why not?
That's not because it just doesn't, because that could be used to justify the invasion of almost any state in the world by any great power. Why not?
Because Russia wouldn't say Mexico is going to deploy surface-to-surface missiles that can hit us in 5 minutes, and a NATO base in the Black Sea displaces our Russian base. So no.
Sure, the United States could invade places in Venezuela or Brazil or Colombia.
Countries.
No, it could apply to.
The argument that Russia's making applies to exactly 2 countries.
The United States could invade Cuba right now if they wanted to, using that argument.
Yeah. Yes, and they would.
But we don't.
But we don't.
Your realist perspective fails.
Did. The Bay of Pigs.
We did, but we don't.
Legitimately didn't. That's why the Bay of Pigs failed. Right? The United States did not successfully invade. Do you think
because they were incompetent, but they tried?
Oh, because they were incompetent. The United States failed an invasion in Cuba because they were incompetent.
Fails,
it's because they lacked.
Say, oh, they didn't.
We didn't. The reason we didn't do a full invasion of Cuba, I'm pretty sure, is because Kennedy didn't want to frame it as an imperialist invasion. Kennedy wanted it framed as like liberated Cubans coming back to save their brothers in arms when they went back. Like we armed and trained Cuban exiles and then just went off to send them to die. It's like an optical thing. Like, literally, it was an optics thing. Militarily, if America wanted to invade Cuba would not exist right now, okay? Holy shit. It's right on our fucking doorstep. We wouldn't even need to deploy, like... We could literally just send planes out from, like, air bases in Florida. Like, we wouldn't even need staging grounds. We could just... We could go to our own pilots in Florida, and we could be like, all right, boys... Long day of work today. Here you go. Load them up. All right. Go. And they would just have to take an extra long sortie that day. And that would be it. Like that. And then they would come back and like half of Cuba would be like fucking ash. Okay. So it has nothing to do with competence. Okay. America didn't do... Hey guys, do you know why America didn't do a full-on invasion of Cuba? The reason why is because they took into consideration the moral objection that people around the world would have to such an action. AKA, the reason they didn't do it was because we factor in ethics into our consideration for what countries can and can't do. Which defeats completely the entire realist worldview. The fact that a country like the United States would deliberately engage in a militarily inferior strategy because they were concerned with optics, which means they were concerned with ethical denunciation. That's clear as day right there. So, all right. The idea that, like, ethics shouldn't be put on the table in part of these deliberations is just not true. Optics Andes win again.
If Russia fails in this Ukraine war, are you going to say, oh, well, that just didn't happen because it
if the United States played by Russia's rules, we would invade Cuba right now. We already have, I think, Guantanamo Bay is in
no, because there's no Russian defensive alliance in Cuba, and there's no surface.
Wait, hold on. That doesn't matter from your realist.
Not talking about
yeah, from a realist perspective, we could do it anyway.
We would invade because we did in Bay of Pigs, and we almost went to nuclear war over the Cuban Missile Crisis.
That doesn't fit your realist perspective, Nick.
Wait, the Cuban Missile Crisis was about missile range capabilities, not about invading and occupying Cuba. The Bay of Pigs invasion wasn't a full invasion because of ethical considerations. So, yeah, it's very stupid.
Cuba has those arms. I would just repeat back to you that strong nations seek to exert their influence over weak nations. Cuba is a weak nation next to the United States. Why don't we just invade them and take them over? That's what Russia would do.
Because they're not putting surface-to-surface missiles there.
Wait,
There's
why
not
does
a
that matter?
defensive
Who
alliance
cares?
there.
Who
Cuba
cares?
is
Yeah.
pacified because Cuba is completely pacified.
Now, you already admitted
Cuba
to me.
poses no.
You already admitted to me
Cuba
that even if
poses
NATO
no
was
threat.
off the table, Russia would still seek to exert influence over Ukraine. It might
They
even
would
still take over
influence. They would
Sevastopol. It might
influence.
still, which
They
might
would
be taking
influence.
Crimea, right?
In the same way that we influence Cuba. And
That's not the same way.
We didn't
down there to take over.
We're not
ports in
invading Cuba.
We don't
Okay,
send.
but now you're just trying to confuse here. Which is it? I mean, we're talking about Russia influencing Ukraine absent the military alliance. And now, I'm saying, well, they influence Cuba, and you're saying, well, they're not invading. It's like, okay, well, Russia didn't invade until the defensive alliance was on the table, and
The
Crimea.
defensive alliance was on the table until Crimea was taken over.
Because NATO membership was on the table after the Maidan. Hello? And 13 countries joined NATO in 10 years. So, once again, this argument falls apart because it rests on all these, just convoluted assumptions, like
They're not convoluted.
a security guarantee. Like, Russia can count on our good faith. The United States doesn't influence weaker states. The Western Hemisphere isn't secured by the Monroe Doctrine. Like, if Cuba became part of a Russian defense alliance, we wouldn't do anything. I mean, these are all just a series of self-evidently ridiculous conclusions, and it's like will not acknowledge that you have the moral standard that Russia is judged by is up here, and the moral standard that the United States is judged on is down here. We can invade, we can influence, we can do whatever. It's no big deal. We decide what sovereignty is. Russia invaded a sovereign nation. Hitler.
Remember when Nick Fuentes pretended to be America first, and now he's like complaining that America gets away with stuff that other countries don't.
Hitler, he's a revanchist.
I've never said that. I'm not saying that at all. Wait, we were having such a good conversation. Why are you strawmanning?
I'm being hyperbolic, of
little
course,
bit.
for the
Okay.
rhetorical device. But
Damn.
Come on,
You would have
Steve.
bet that
Come
you
on,
would have been the one
Steven.
calling
Come
me
on,
Hitler in this
Steven.
argument.
You
huh?
gotta work with me here. You gotta work with me. Your native Cuba. America would crush your native Cuba. What would the Cuban people think if the Americans crushed your native Cuba for trying to join a defensive alliance with Russia? They would do it. The Council on Foreign Relations would
What the
crush
fuck
your
is he
native
talking-
country, Cuba.
First of all,
If
my
Cuba tried to
native
develop
country is the
missiles.
United States.
Wait. This happened. The Cold War happened. And even with Cuba being a Soviet ally, we still didn't invade them. We still didn't commit as hard as we could have. We still tried to make it out to be like a friendly coup. Actually, the funny thing is, what we did in Cuba is actually a really close parallel to what Russia did in the Donbass region, right? When Russia wanted to exert influence over Ukraine, they didn't jump right to invasion. Instead, what they did was they funded a bunch of separatists in the region. Now, that wasn't workable in Cuba for a few reasons. Language, cultural differences, ocean, blah, blah, blah. So instead, we sent our Cuban exiles back, who all immediately died. But, the underlying principle is about the same. We didn't invade, though.
States. I was born in Omaha, Nebraska. Okay, cute. So regardless, I guess just to center closing. So your position is that the current Russian invasion of Ukraine is justified,
Thanks,
and
RJ.
Russia has carte blanche to do whatever they need to bring that nation to heel because of hypothetical security threats in the future.
anything more
that
in this
may
region?
exist if Ukraine joins NATO?
Well, no, we're not
Like
talking
any other
about
major
carte
paths
blanche.
I'm missing?
We're talking
Well, so
about-
would you
let's
like
get
condemn them for
specific.
what's going on in like Mariupol today or in
No.
any of the?
Yes? Okay, gotcha.
That's
Okay.
nonsense.
Yo, you don't believe any of it's real? There's like reporting, there's photo. You think all of it is
There
fake?
was reporting, hey, what happened to that nuclear power plant that was, do you remember when you said that 2 weeks ago? You said, they're attacking a nuclear power plant. It turned out that was total bullshit. Yeah,
I don't think it was total
it's called
bullshit. They were
lies.
like, they
Western
were
media lies.
So just to be clear, what's on the table right now? So Mariupol.
Western media lies. He's so snaky. He has effortlessly adopted the tanky talking points. Effortlessly. It's such a perfect demonstration of how ideologically synchronous tankies and Nazis are. Before it was Jewish media, now it's Western media. It doesn't make a difference to him from his perspective because because none of it ever mattered, It's so direct. I appreciate the bluntness of it all.
is not cut off from like electricity, water, food, not cut off from humanitarian aid with hundreds of thousands. You don't think any of that is?
It's a war. This is the conduct of war.
Sure. So they have carte blanche to shell the city, to bomb theaters, to bomb hospitals, whatever. That's what they did in Aleppo, right? That's what they did in Aleppo. Every single hospital and every single FSA occupied area was bombed. So those people had nowhere to go except back to Assad. This is Russian strategy 101.
You're saying blank check. You're saying it's not a blank check.
It's what they did in Grozny. That city is more destroyed than any other city in the world because they were frustrated that their military wasn't advancing fast enough. We're seeing the same thing happen today in Ukraine.
Such a sad pivot. See, I mean, you lose on the fundamental point.
I'm talking on the actual. I'm just asking you if like they have the right to go in and conduct war and destroy as much of Ukraine as they need to bring them to heel because of potential hypothetical security threats.
If they wanted to destroy as much of Ukraine as they needed to, the war would look very different than it does right now. And you know that.
But it's taken a different turn, a darker turn over the past week.
It's a limited military engagement, and as far as
limited to one fifth their military.
It is limited. They're not attacking Poland. They're not attacking the Baltics. They're not.
Wait, what? Russia's holding back because they're not launching a simultaneous 5-strike capability on Ukraine and 4 NATO countries? What? Yeah. You see, they're holding it back. You see, they haven't simultaneously invaded every country on Earth. You fool, you moron. This whip snake is very dangerous. Jesus Christ.
They're not,
military engagement means they're not attacking every country on their border.
You need to interrupt because I tell the truth here.
Okay.
They're conducting a war. It's a war. Destiny, you know this. And yes, I support the war. Absolutely. I support
+6, Tristan.
the president, the new czar, Vladimir Putin. I support Russia. Absolutely. I support what's going on. And I think that it's defensible. I think that this is the most reasonable European war that is.
Also, okay, so leaving aside the czar comment, obviously, fascist, blah-de-blah. Leaving that aside, I do think it's remarkable how this entire time he's been desperately trying to adopt Mearsheimer's, like, restraint by pretending that he's avoiding normative claims, and this is only about what countries can do and what they will do. And then at the end, he's like, yeah, I support them, and I support their war. So it's not just like descriptively, this is what will happen and we have to recognize it, but normatively, I think it's happening and it's a good thing, which even Mearsheimer doesn't do. Mearsheimer will do this, this hand-waving about how, well, it's the West's fault this is happening, but it's ultimately bad that it's happening. Even Nick Fuentes earlier in this convo was like, I don't like this. I don't like this situation, I don't like anything that's going on here. But of course, that's a lie. He's fine with bloodshed because it's Nick Fuentes. Any update in the Mearsheimer debate? Guys, I haven't even sent Mearsheimer an email yet. I don't know why people in my community thought when I said I got to get a debate with this guy, that meant I would send him an email right away. I don't do anything right away. I'm lazy as fuck. I don't know why people assume that.
Has happened in the past 100 years. I think this is the most reasonable war in the 21st century. Absolutely. I think, and to give you a comparison, I think this is more justifiable than the American war in Iraq. I think this is more justifiable than the NATO intervention in Libya. I think it's more justifiable than the American war in Afghanistan, frankly. I think this is a completely reasonable conflict. And, the argument seems to be like, well, war is always wrong, and like national sovereignty is the sacred thing, except for when it isn't, except for when war is justified, and except for when sovereignty is conditional. It's just that you arbitrarily decide the terms based on.
They're not arbitrary. They're international courts, the UN.
The Western world system, right? I mean, when you talk about, they're international norms or something, invading Iraq wasn't based on international norms. The world
Who's
opposed that.
defending
France
Iraq?
didn't even support that, okay? France didn't even support the war in Iraq. But the United States pursued it and more people died in Iraq than have died in Ukraine.
So far.
And we occupied Iraq for 20 years, and there wasn't this boycott, there wasn't I stand with fucking Iraq, and nobody talked about Saddam Hussein's sovereignty.
Wait, what? When we invaded Iraq, the global protests that broke out because of that, I think, were some of the largest in all of human history. Am I wrong on that one? The anti-war protests, even though they weren't given much media coverage for fairly obvious reasons, I think were they were some of the largest to have ever taken place. They were enormous.
So, I mean, just give it a rest. I mean, America's a global hegemon. We project power globally, soft and hard power. Russia is
well, we're projecting our power now.
Regional power, and they're exerting influence in their region. Ukraine's not a part of NATO. There's no defensive alliance yet. I think it's reasonable. I think it's totally reasonable based on the things I laid out, between the missiles, between NATO being a counter-Russian alliance, NATO outspending Russia like 12-1, more than, I don't know the math right off the top of my head, but more than 10-1, 1.2 trillion to 65 billion. Like, yeah, Russia has a right to be concerned about all these things: the confidence in mutually assured destruction, the theater support missiles becoming part of the U.S. military doctrine, NATO base in Crimea has a right to be concerned. So limited engagement, and I'm glad that this argument wasn't about Russia rebuilding the empire, because it's not happening. Notice how quickly the goal, it started out with like, Russia's rebuilding a collapsed empire, to like, well, Russia does nothing to worry about that the ABM shields being built. Russia's not, invading Iraq's totally legit.
What the fuck is he talking about? At this point, he's just this is like spazzing out at this point. Like, has Destiny said anything even neutral about the Iraq war? At this point, it's just completely like unhinged rattling. Yeah. It is funny though. Oh, hello, Patches. I do have to say though, it is pretty funny how here, we'll go to this place. It is pretty funny how, like, how long has Nick Fuentes' main talking point been, like, the defense of the West? Like, Western civilization, European powers. Instantly it switches. Let this be a reminder to all of you, okay? The only thing that Nick Fuentes genuinely cares about, or I should say things, because there are a few things. The only things that he genuinely cares about in the face of it all is killing Jews and black people and power. Those are the only actual things that he cares about. Literally any other political positions he holds are fully secondary to those. They are completely subservient to those points. That's it. Those are it. And things that lead to that, that's where it gets you. Like, it's like how, like, TERFs will try to convince you that there are a million legitimate concerns they have for, like, trans people and the threat they may pose to cis women. But we know the truth, don't we? The truth is that they hate trans women because they hate trans women. There isn't a reason. Have you ever argued with a racist who like hated black people because of like crime, and then you disproved their crime arguments, and they were like, oh, okay, and they were no longer racist? It's a disease of the mind. It's a pathology. It's an illness of the thoughts. So for Nick Fuentes, there's nothing unnatural or strange at all about effortlessly switching from pro-European supremacy talking points to anti-Western government talking points. There's no contradiction there, because his point was never really about Europe. His point was always about, well, like I said, his real values.
Invading Libya, it's international conventions, because it would be preposterous to suggest anything like what the NATO Western media suggests, which is that Russia's rebuilding an empire. We know they can't do that. We know they don't have the capability. He's been in power for 22 years, and what does he have? Abkhazia, South Ossetia, Donbass, Crimea, it's peanuts. He lost Kazakhstan. He lost Ukraine. He lost all these countries. And people go, Abkhazia, South Ossetia, Donbass. He lost all of Central Asia. And they've got and they spent 67 billion. We spent 820. And we go, they're the empire. They're the empire. They're the aggressors. They're the military hogs. There's just, it's insane. I don't understand it, Destiny. Steven, help me understand this.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know who half your points are even addressing at this point. You haven't really demonstrated that there is a legitimate security concern by Russia with Ukraine. You've admitted yourself that even if Ukraine didn't join NATO, they still might have the, from the realist perspective, good enough reason to invade Ukraine, take over Crimea, take over as much of Ukraine as they want, because that's just what big nations do. And if that is going to be the argument that you use, then by God, just like we've done with every other former Warsaw Pact state, or a lot of them, and just like we've done with other Eastern European countries, you know what? We should just draft Ukraine into NATO then, just for, if no other reason, to ensure Ukraine's sovereignty. This idea that NATO is an empire just like Russia, that the United States is hegemonic just like Russia, I mean, the difference is, and we've seen this clearly, is that at least people want to join the United States hegemony, as opposed to Russia, that has to force itself with shelling civilian cities and invading places and cutting off oil if you don't agree with them, and trying to poison your elected officials with uranium and whatever other crazy shit Russia has to do to countries around it. I don't think that the pressure that NATO NATO exerts on other countries to join them when that pressure is, we'll protect you from Russia that will actually invade you and destroy you. I don't think that's legitimately at all comparable to the type of pressure that Russia exerts on other nations around it. And I certainly don't think that the realist analysis of Russia just wants to control countries is a good enough reason to allow Russia to invade any country they want. But
well, yeah, I mean, I think that's really the debate is like, they want freedom. The Iraqis want freedom. America, the world wants.
No one is saying that. No
one keeps bringing up Iraq.
The Iraqi people didn't vote for the United States to come to that country. Why would you? Wait, do you think? Hold on, wait. I'm curious. Do you think I would defend the war? Do you think I would defend the war in Iraq? Or are you arguing against a straw man now because you know you kind of run out of steam?
You said the difference is that the world wants American hegemony.
I'm saying that Ukraine and states that joined NATO were begging to get into NATO. Initially, we didn't even know. Absolutely, they were. And look at what's happening now.
In Ukraine?
In Ukraine?
Yes.
Not until they took over Crimea. That's when public opinion shifted, when it was on the table for them to seriously consider joining. And you know what? When you've got a superpower that decides to take over a huge peninsula in your country and then decide to start funding separatist civil wars in the eastern part of your country, would you agree both these things have happened? Yes, that's not only did opinion shift, but also you have to keep in mind, Nick, logically, right? Most of the opposition to NATO came from Crimea. So of course, when you capture that part, and then you recognize breakaway states in the east that are all like majority, like
come from
Russians,
Eastern Ukraine,
Russians,
from
so
Crimea?
yeah, no shit, they're gonna be massively pro-NATO when Russia starts invading the places that are the most opposed to it, and then
now
starts
you just have to distort the facts. I mean,
I'm not distorting any fact. Wait, hold on. Are you saying that Eastern Ukraine was more pro-NATO than Western Ukraine?
Are you saying? But you say. Well, the difference is that the world beckons for because you said America's not a hegemon like Russia.
I never. I said that.
What the fuck is he talking? Okay, unironically, I think like Nick has ADHD or something. He was able to keep it coherent for a little bit early on, but at this point, like he's just full on soying out. Feel like he could. I feel like he could push the Nazi agenda much better if he would get on like Ritalin or something, because he's getting lost in the sauce right there. Like, for real, though, right? Like, oh, shit. Don't follow me. He was holding it together for a bit, but at this point, like, he's actually just like a wheel, like a broken wheel running. What? No, thank you.
Joining NATO. I said literally joining NATO is not the same as Russia invading you.
Hang on, let me explain. Earlier you said, well, America's not a hegemon like Russia, and the difference is that this is like an exact quote. You said they're not a hegemon like Russia because the difference is that these states want America. You said that they're begging for NATO, but they weren't begging for NATO since 2008.
All right, so like to be clear again. The countries that are in NATO want to be in NATO. There's not like a coercive element there. The only coercive element being provided is the Russian coercive element. Apart from that, like these countries are doing so of their own free will. Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Poland, like, do you think like East Germany protested? Like, no, of course not. These countries want to be in NATO. Because we're based in red-pilled, and Russia is soy and cuck-pilled.
2008, that's when the conversation starts. And Germany and France oppose it.
That's why they were only given the membership as path to membership.
Yes,
they weren't actually given. Yeah, of course.
Yes, but Germany and France, they agree with me. Germany and France in 2008 say this is too aggressive. For the same reason, they said this is going to provoke Russia. This is going to cause a crisis on the continent. And so all they can say, as you say, at Bucharest is, well, we recognize their aspirations. In 2008, Ukraine's not begging to join NATO, but they're acknowledging their aspirations.
Sure.
In 2010, Yanukovych is elected. It moves forward in spite of this. In 2014, it's not an election, it's a coup. It's a coup, which is not supported by the majority of the population.
It absolutely what? The opposition leader was the one that rose to power afterwards.
No, it was not.
Yanukovych ran from the country because he ordered his police to shoot at his citizens.
Hang on. See, now you're interrupting because the majority of Ukrainian people did not support NATO membership.
No,
the majority
correct.
in 24. No, you're wrong.
That's correct. No, I'm agreeing with you. Not until Crimea was removed, which was where your most anti-NATO population was.
Hang on. So in 14, they're not begging for it. Not even a majority supports it. And not even a majority supports Maidan. Not even a majority of Ukrainians support Maidan.
I don't know what point he's trying to make here exactly. When Destiny is like the Ukrainian people wanted to be in NATO, and Nick Fuentes is like, no, they didn't. Destiny's like, yeah, they did. And Nick Fuentes is like, okay, well, no, they didn't, as long as you go back in time to before Russia did the really bad thing 8 years ago. Like, no, they didn't, as long as you... It's like... it's like saying, like, hey, listen, you fucking punched me, and that was fucked up. And you're like, no, I didn't, as long as we go back 2 years to before that didn't... When that hadn't happened yet, okay? Like, what the fuck are you talking about? I'm sorry, I'm so tired.
Nevertheless, a pro-Western leader is installed, and they begin moving
Wait, what do you
towards
mean
the West.
installed? He was the opposition leader. He was the next guy that was coming up. What do you mean? He didn't just come from nowhere.
When a coup happens, yeah, okay, it's a coup, Destiny. It's not like somebody ran on a platform of let's join NATO. They overthrew the government.
Overthrew. He fled the country after he did because he was worried that he was going to be tried for fucking war crimes when his cops.
Yeah, guys, remember? The reason Yanukovych fled Ukraine was because the prosecutors did not promise to give him special protections when the coup took place. He literally fled there, and then, because the leader fled, the opposition leader was the one who took charge. Like, that makes sense, doesn't it? Like, yeah, your leader fled, so the opposition leader takes charge. He didn't have to flee. He could have just stayed and you know, been arrested. Is that not a coup? The issue is that coup as a term describes such a huge range of behavior, and what Nick Fuentes, as a lot of tankies do, what he's trying to do right now is use the broadness of the term to paint a picture as though a Western-backed insurrectionist movement deposed the leader and replaced them with their own guy, which is not what happened at all. Instead, there were protests against his insane fucking pro-Russia bullshit. He started killing protesters, and then when the protesters finally won, he fled the country because he knew he would be locked up for the rest of his life if he was tried for what he had done. And then, with no leader in charge of the country, obviously the next, like, biggest political figure is going to take charge. The opposition leader held power for, like, a year, and then they had elections. And the elections, as far as international courts have ruled, were free and fair. And the Ukrainian people came together and they made a decision on this.
Is it democratic to have a coup, to have a violent revolution?
Why are you saying democratic when part of the reasons why he was protesting so heavily is because he literally tried to pass like 10 anti-protest laws? That's not democratic either.
I do think it's democratic to protest.
When you overthrow the government,
an authoritarian.
When the government makes it illegal to protest and starts killing protesters, that's not very democratic either.
So what are our standards now? So what are our standards? If some people don't like something the government does, then elections... Now democracy is when the people overthrow the government because the government passed an anti-protest law.
Again, elections did happen. Yanukovych chose to flee the country. He literally could have stayed. He could have remained leader. And then he could have been arrested. And then he could have spent the rest of his life in jail. Like, yeah. Supporting a revolt against an authoritarian is a pro-democracy move. It's a pro-gamer move and a pro-democracy move. Wasn't Nick Fuentes literally at the insurrection? I don't know. I don't remember. Good memes, though.
So which is it? Is it about what the people want?
I don't know what
is it about sovereignty, or are all these things conditional? It's conditional.
Of course, everything is conditional, Nick. Why are you acting like Destiny? Are you saying that committing crimes against humanity will forfeit your sovereignty? Of course, Nick. What do you mean? Like nothing is unraveling at all right now.
Here it is.
Mega cope from Nick.
Okay, tell me why. Tell me why.
Because you're the crux of your argument is you say like, well, you know, when the U.S. exerts influence on Ukraine. That's okay.
There was no Ukraine. You're reminded it was not a U.S.-driven protest.
Okay, but the point, we're not talking about Maidan right now. We're talking about NATO membership.
No, we were just talking about Maidan and the coup.
No, we're going back.
Okay,
we're taking
let's go back to NATO membership.
You said the difference between American and Russian power is that the Ukrainian people want American power and the Russian people do not. You said America hegemony, they don't have hegemony. Because the Ukrainian people consent to it, they want it, they don't want Russia. But the conversation about NATO membership begins in 2008 when that is not the majority position.
And they don't join because they don't want to.
Okay, hang on. Hang on.
Yeah.
Okay.
And in 2014, it's still not the majority position.
And they still don't join because they don't want
to. Hang on. Why are you jumping the gun here? It's because you know what's coming. You know what's coming.
What's coming?
You know what's coming.
Where their minds change when Russia invades them? They're like, okay, we changed our mind. Now we want to join NATO. Is that supposed to be surprising?
Yeah, it's like, wait, I've got an epic own for you lined up. Did you know they only wanted to... Oh, shit, it just got disconnected from OBS. Hold on. Give it a second. Give it a second. Yeah, Russia attacked my my internet connection. All right, we're back. Yeah. I like the, I don't know what you call it, the like implication here. Like, ha! You said that Ukraine wanted to join NATO, but they only wanted to join NATO after Russia invaded their territory. Like, okay. All right.
So sad for you. It's so over for you.
I'm losing so high right now. Yeah, tell me.
Yeah, you are. You are. Because, you said they're begging for it. They're begging for it. They're not begging for it. NATO is moving across Eastern Europe, and they're not begging for it. The majority doesn't support it. They're talking about it in 08. In 08, they're saying they're going to make Ukraine a NATO member state, and the majority don't support it. In 14, they're talking about, hang on, why do you keep interrupting me?
Wait, can you acknowledge,
14,
you can't just make somebody.
I can't even complete it.
You can't just make them a NATO state, right? They have to consent to join, right?
That's been good the whole time.
When they say they acknowledge the aspirations of Ukraine, I mean, they're saying they have designs on Ukraine.
What does that mean? Ukraine has to consent to join, right?
Okay, so in 2008, if the majority don't support, why is the United States, against the wishes of Germany and France, talking about Ukraine being a NATO member?
Wait, what? Wait, the United States can't even talk with Ukrainian leaders about potentially joining? Wait, I didn't realize that a country not wanting to do something meant that the leadership of another country can't even talk to them about how it's open to them in the future. What the fuck does that even mean?
I'm saying in Ukraine.
No, in 2008. In 2008, why is the United States saying we recognize their aspirations if the majority don't support it?
What? Because they can recognize their aspirations. Ultimately, it still has to be approved by every NATO member. Come on, what?
Obviously.
No, I'm asking you.
But why would they say that? They're not begging for it in 08, so why is the United States saying
how is that relevant? It doesn't change the fact, Nick, will Ukraine join NATO against Ukraine's will?
No.
Okay, will Ukraine be taken over by Russia against Ukraine's will?
No.
That's the difference. Yes, of course, Nick. No. What do you mean no? Then why is there a war right now? What? What are we fighting over?
What you're arguing is that there's a principal moral difference, a normative difference in how the United States exercises influence between as compared to Russia. But this is not the case. Because in 2000, Israel, and by the way, and you yourself said, the United States was pushing more strongly about Ukrainian NATO membership. They watered down what they said at Bucharest in 2008 at the behest of the Germans and the French. They watered it down for NATO to say, we recognize their aspirations. They weren't begging.
I do love how stupid Nick's point is, that he has to pretend Russia wouldn't try to conquer Ukraine when it's literally the thing they're debating. And earlier he said he believed it was right for Russia to do so. Earlier he was literally saying, I think Russia is in the right. I think Russia's in the right to do this. I think it's epic and based and red-pilled and anti-Jew pilled for them to invade Ukraine. It's so epic. And now, like, he was talking the new, I support the new SAR, Z. and then Destiny's like, okay, so you recognize that, like, Russia will invade Ukraine against their will, right? And he has to be like, no? What? Who? That'd be horrible. Who would do that?
For it in 2008, but yet this was the conversation. That was a diluted proposition, was we recognize the aspirations. And then in 2014, the government is overthrown by a coup that is not, in 2014, the majority does not support NATO membership, and in 2014, the majority does not support the Maidan. So your argument rests on this idea on two things, that Russia violated sovereignty and Ukraine has a right to self-determination. But both of these things are in doubt now, because now you're saying, well, the coup, it doesn't matter that the coup wasn't a democratic election.
Z, Destiny.
Because, well, Yanukovych did an anti-democratic thing, and even though the coup that wasn't popularly supported by half the population, it wasn't an election, overthrew him and installed the pro-Western leader, it doesn't matter at all. It's like, okay, so which is it then?
All of the elections,
self-determination and national sovereignty both appear to be completely conditional.
I don't know,
because it's a coup-backed government that creates the crisis in Crimea. And it is, national sovereignty, which you say is conditional and apparently determined by NATO. So, that's where the argument falls apart here.
He sounds like
so
Moppin.
you keep
they're
saying
both
that it's
Vaush.
a coup-backed government. The government
Also, they're both
had
very
popular
nasally.
support post-revolution. Or do you?
Was it elected? Was this a?
They held
is this
elections
the
afterwards, and
normative-
who kept winning?
But
Pro-Western
that's
leaders.
not the constitutional process, is it?
So now,
You know,
now the constitutional process. I mean, wasn't
you
it
telling me-
voted on? Wasn't it voted on by every member of parliament afterwards? Didn't they take a vote in parliament after Yanukovych left? Did they not? Was that not the constitutional process?
No, there's no constitutional provision for a revolution. Obviously, I mean, would you say that if on January 6th, if
Wait, what the fuck are you supposed to do if your leader just flees the country because he's committed crimes and doesn't want to face the music? What do you do then? What the fuck do you do? Law? Yeah, Nick is such a liberal.
if the Republicans overthrew the government and then the Congress voted for Trump, would you say, oh yeah, that checks out? Like, yeah, that's legitimate. Of course not.
If it seemed like the majority of the United
Okay, a better comparison to this, one that would actually make Nick's point, would be if there was a popular like protest that Biden like had his officers start killing protesters, and then when it looks like the protests might overwhelm the police, Biden fled the country to avoid prosecution for his crimes. After all of that, if then like as an interim like president fucking like the next leader came in, the only question is Ukraine has a parliamentary system, right? So for them, the next like they have a different chain of succession. What is the chain of succession for Ukraine chain of succession? Their VP? What did the VP do? Because they do have prime ministers. The line of succession 2014. I'll look more into it later. I'm very tired. I'm just waiting for this debate to be over.
United States supported it. If Trump held an election afterwards and he won the election, then yeah, I mean, probably it seems like, I mean, like it's still a form of like coup or revolution, but like to say, to pretend that it like, it would be like a more apt comparison is you're trying to make it sound like Trump at the very least, like him or hate him, had massive popularity in the United States, right? It's not like Trump was like an installed leader. Let's say that Trump did win that after a quote unquote coup. Would you call Trump an installed leader after a coup? Probably not. You would probably be here making the argument, well, Trump enjoys wide support from the majority of the United States. Yeah, but you're realist and nobody uses realism. Nobody cares about realism. Nobody uses these arguments. It doesn't matter.
But you
okay?
believe, oh no, it does matter.
It absolutely doesn't.
I would say advantage is good. Whatever is good for America is good. You would say, as the liberal, well, it wasn't.
Hold on, wait, I haven't even finished responding. You cannot.
Wait, now he's for America when before he was like, well, Western governments always lie. See, again, it doesn't matter. The actual point doesn't matter.
Call it a coup, okay? When they formed a temporary government, when they had elections later that year, and they allowed all the elections to play out. That's exactly what happened, and they had it with the support of the parliament and the support of the people the entire time. You can try to cry and say it was installed or CIA led or whatever, but the reality is that Ukraine had like democratic processes working throughout the entire time. Does it suck that Yanukovych left after like having police assassinate people in the street? Yeah, I guess that does suck. So maybe there was some.
It was a coup. So your argument goes something. Let me just paraphrase your argument so far. America does not influence weaker states. Maidan was not a coup.
Oh man, dude,
and
why you
there's
have to
no
straw man the
security
fuck out
threat
of
to
me?
Russia posed by surface-to-surface missiles in Ukraine. Oh, okay, yeah, it's all yeah, that sounds legit to me. Yeah, it checks out.
All right, Ralph, do we go to the because now we're in the like make up what other people say phase. So I think we've hit rock bottom on this argument now.
People can discern for themselves.
Sure.
People can discern. I mean, that seems to be the argument. You know, Russia has no legitimate security threat by the shield and the surface.
You even admitted that even sans NATO, they would still invade Ukraine. So it seems like you agree with that as well. Yeah.
Okay, sure.
All right, now
it's just ridiculous.
You know, I'm gonna look through here and see if we have some questions from Super Chat and stuff like that. I guess if you guys want to put
Destiny,
like a capstone,
why are you so Jewish?
Presentations here first before maybe I go to that might work too. I don't know. It's up to you guys. Or do you want me to just look for questions?
I think a closing statement would be in order.
Yeah, and then I'll do questions after, right? So you guys can have
Probably not funny,
you know, your presentation down pat. Yeah, okay. So go ahead. I think I don't recall fully, but I think it was Destiny that led off, right?
The real funny thing, by the way, the really funny meme that Destiny could pull right here is that the realist position with regards to Israel is one of massive support for America. There's no getting around that. If you just believe that like geopolitical hegemons should act like their own security and other countries have to back off when they have a better claim, like there is no other power in the region besides Israel that has a stronger claim to that region in terms of like you know, defensive military capabilities, because of course we back Israel up. And if you actually cared about like protecting American interests, you have to back that up. So pointing that out would be pretty fucking funny, you know, like, oh, we're a realist. Okay, so you agree that like America should do everything that it can to promote its security interests in the Middle East, which we have massive security interests in the Middle East, by the way. Obviously, there are a number of reasons why geopolitically we find it useful to maintain Israel as the world's most expensive military base. Yeah, I deserve that. Okay, let me alt tab. No. Let me do it. I have to wait for the death screen to pop up because I can't hit pause when I die. No. Okay, Stake of America. Stake of America. Let's go.
So, okay, so that would be you leading off here then, and then.
No, let Nick lead off here. I led off with the opening.
No,
you
lead
off.
No,
I'm not going to give you the final word on the opening statement and the last word. Are you serious?
Well,
It usually rotates.
What? Hey,
Or we could do how we've been doing it and talk at the same time, maybe.
Says, the normative law. You're invading this debate.
Yeah,
Why can't they get off the
Defending
horse?
normative
Ralph,
laws
you have
of
the
debate.
sovereignty in this conversation, so you have to decide which hegemonic influence is going to prevail
Mute
here.
him,
And
mute
talk about
him.
the last word.
Sovereign Ralph.
stack the deck either way.
Kill Ralph.
I just thought that was the normative rules, kind of that you should have the first on the closing.
Okay.
Since first debate. I mean, if you really want to close, I mean, it's fine.
I really want to close, but he does too. So now we have a
But,
conflict here that you have to resolve, Ralph.
Remember you were doing a debate with
what?
Stryker? Remember you were doing a debate with Stryker and Allsup? They didn't understand the concept of, like, the person who closes first opens... Yeah, I remember that. Do you guys remember that behind-the-scenes shit from that debate? When, like, Destiny and I... Like, everyone is chilling in the back room, like, waiting for everything to get started, and, like, Stryker is struggling with the concept of, like, one person going first, and then the next person going next. Like, he's actually, like, mentally... He's reaching his limit, you know? Hate to admit, but D is funny when he's fighting fascists. Guys, the problems with Destiny aren't that he's stupid or that he's not funny. He's smart and funny, okay? I think it's important to understand why you dislike people, you know? Because if you don't understand why you dislike people, you'll be positively surprised by them when they engage in behavior they always have, and you'll think it contests your previous negative assertions. The problem with him was never intelligence or humor. Wait, hold on. We're about to fucking get this guy. Dude, this axe is OP. Holy shit. I attack so quickly. Stop standing in the lava pool. Oh shit. We're dancing. It's the default speedrun weapon. Is that true? Did I, like, just stumble into the default speedrun weapon? Not anymore. I guess this is just my my natural game sense, you know? I think you'd enjoy the dual blades. I have not found a single dual blade yet. Just let me hit your... Thank you.
Being first is a privilege and being last is a privilege. Usually the person that goes first in the opening goes first in the end.
I'm looking for. I don't actually.
He's looking for a UN Security Council resolution on.
Pull up Robert's rules. Robert's rules of order. Let's go. Let's check them. Let's check them.
I have a coin around here somewhere. Surely.
Let's post E to support Ethan Ralph's war.
You would think I could go downstairs and flip a coin. You know what? I'll go downstairs and get a quarter.
Ethan's campaign to Richmond. E.
That's so fucking. I don't have any coin here. Like
Tristan, I don't want
Okay,
help.
can you guys argue for a couple more seconds while I go get a coin?
I'll just go first. I mean, it's not even appropriate, but I'll go first. I mean,
I hope that Ukrainian citizens have the same resiliency that I had to withstand that.
You repelled the attack. You repelled.
Yeah, okay. If you're willing to see
my generals have been killed. I'm encountering Steve, the ghost of Cuba, the ghost of Havana.
Thank God, he flies over the sky, shooting down
ghost
cozy
of
TV
Omaha.
streams one at a time.
Damn it! This ghost of Omaha is destroying my capabilities. Ugh.
All right, go ahead then.
I'm so mad. Okay, all right. So in closing, I think that was basically a nice summary enough. Just at the end there.
Quit spewing.
And I don't want to go too long, but the crux of the argument is this. America is not a benign hegemon. America is the world superpower, and with NATO is a hyperpower still. $1.2 trillion in military spending, more sophisticated capability than anybody can recognize. And all it takes is to put yourselves in the shoes of the Russians and in Moscow to understand where Russia is coming from. The suspension of the ABM Treaty in 2001, the suspension of the Intermediate Nuclear Forces Treaty in 2019, these in themselves
to go even further beyond.
The reintroduction of theater support missiles into Europe destabilizes the balance of power. And that is, of course, notwithstanding the largest concern, which is the continued expansion of NATO since 1999. NATO is an explicitly anti-Russian alliance. It's formed to contain Russia and principally to contain Russian influence and power. After the Soviet Union dissolved and Russia became weaker, NATO remained and expanded. And now it's expanding on Russia's borders, compromising its vital strategic interests, its naval base in Crimea, its Black Sea Fleet, and the territory of Ukraine. You know, what NATO membership for Ukraine entails is surface-to-surface missiles, which can strike Russia in 5 minutes. It entails a tripwire in Ukraine that is right on Russia's border. It entails NATO domination of the Black Sea. And ultimately, this is about NATO and American domination of its adversaries and no concession given to its adversaries that they might have legitimate security interests. They might have legitimate interests as powerful states and all, and recognizing that and negotiating with them and working with them towards an equitable security arrangement. That's what we're talking about here, is an equitable and fair security arrangement. Destiny has talked about sovereignty, which, of course, we know the United States considers conditional. When Russia invades Ukraine, it's a gross violation of sovereignty. But when we invade Libya, Iraq, and bomb other countries, of course, these exceptions are valid. It's called right to protect. We can fabricate this out of thin air. We say that Ukraine has a right to self-determination, but it is true that the United States backed the Maidan Revolution. That could be disputed, but nevertheless, we support that government. We've given billions of dollars in assistance to that coup government, and we've supported that coup government's aspirations to join NATO. So once again, self-determination appears to be somewhat conditional. And then what's more fundamentally about all of this, this is a bad outcome. This is a bad outcome that nobody wanted. How did we arrive here? What were the root causes and the precipitating causes? Let's even just be fair and say, at the minimum, we have to recognize that the United States has played a role in this. To say that it is all Russian revanchism belies the military imbalance, which is very real. It belies Russia's capabilities and the fact that in 22 years of rule, Vladimir Putin has not taken over any countries, invaded any sovereign countries. It was in response to the 2014 crisis and in response to the suggestion that Ukraine might go nuclear and join NATO, that Russia invaded Ukraine. How did we arrive here? We have to look at our own role. We have to look at our own role in disrupting the mutually assured destruction confidence with the ABM and the Intermediate Nuclear Forces Treaty withdrawal. We have to recognize our role destabilizing other countries around the world with NATO aggression. We have to recognize our role in expanding NATO in a way that Russia's repeatedly said makes them uncomfortable, and even where they've drawn red lines. And so, if my victory condition in the debate is merely for people to say NATO played a part and Russia has some valid interest here, I think we cover that. I think I won on those grounds.
So, first of all, NATO played a part. This is like that thing. Like, well, can you admit that NATO was involved? Yeah, it's involved in everything. It's a fucking. It's a treaty alliance between some of the most powerful countries on Earth. Of course, it's involved in fucking everything ever. Okay, so yeah, that's one. And then for two, Nick was never able to indicate that they were legitimate security concerns. Not once. Destiny said multiple times, like, hey, like this isn't real, like this is fantasy, you know? Nick had no counter when Destiny pointed out that putting missiles in Ukraine would not change the mutually assured destruction capabilities of the Western powers to engage in a first strike. None of the math changes at all. Nick was never able to indicate how Ukraine being a part of NATO would have actually exacerbated any geopolitical concerns that Russia has. Unless that concern they have is we want to be able to invade nearby countries. Fuck you guys, I haven't even beaten the first tree sentinel yet. I just want the map. Map, men, map, men, map, 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 men, 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 men.
The other side has to say that America is a benign hegemon. The world wants American power. The world invites American power. American power is innocuous. Russia has nothing to fear. Russia has no valid concerns. It's just run by a corrupt despot who's only using security concerns as a pretext for territorial ambitions. I think throughout the debate that was made, I think from the outset that was conceded not to be true. So that's my closing statement. America is not a benign hegemon. This is a limited, reasonable military engagement, certainly more reasonable than the things NATO has done in this century. And I support Russia. Go Russia! We salute the brave soldiers, the Moscow's finest, the Tsar's finest, as they liberate Ukraine from the Western dogs. So that's my closing statement. Z.
I will concede the entire debate to Nick of whether or not America is a benign hegemon. Unfortunately, that is not at all what we came here to talk about today. I understand that when Russia is in the process of invading another country, they very much want to center the conversation about Russian-American relationships or about the sovereignty of the United States or the sovereignty of Russia or the way that these two superpowers act, but that is not what the discussion is about today. It's whether or not Russia's invasion into Ukraine can be justified. We can bring up as many defeated talking points as we want. I'm used to people doing it over and over and over again. We can talk about how the suspension of some ABM treaty magically destroys second strike capabilities, even though when Nick was pushed, he admitted that an ABM silo cannot become an ICBM silo. He admitted that Putin was allowed access to these silos by Biden if he wanted to investigate. He admitted that this technology that Putin is so worried about doesn't even exist yet. It might not be here for 10, 20, or 30 years. And he admitted that if this technology was so threatening, who cares? We could install it just as easily in Poland, Romania, Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia, down in Turkey. If we wanted to nuke Russia from anywhere, if we wanted to encircle Russia from anywhere, if we wanted to have ABM silos around the world that could intercept an
Just a reminder for how stupid this talking point is, that, like, Russia needs to make sure Ukraine isn't in NATO to protect itself against first strike capabilities, okay? Like, look at a fucking map, okay? Hold on. Let me just pull up a map of Europe. No! No! We have to invade Ukraine. We have to invade Ukraine so they can't engage in first strike capabilities of these missiles with thousands of miles of range against us. And then you have Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Poland, Turkey. You know, like, okay, yeah, sure. Yes, that would make the critical difference. See, a salvo of thousands of nuclear ICBMs from these countries, well, that's survivable, but Ukraine, not so much. That's EU, not NATO. Don't pay attention to this or the colors. I'm pointing out the countries. Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Poland, Turkey. The map, I just Googled map of Europe. We're not looking at EU countries. Inshallah, soon Ukraine will be on this map.
Infinite amount of MIRVs, then infinite amount of ICBMs, we could already do it. We don't need Ukraine to do that. Just like Nick already admitted that even if Ukraine never even had an accession plan to NATO, Russia, in the realist perspective, would just invade them anyway. They have a right to it. Why? Because of strategic interest in the Black Sea that Turkey is constantly threatening anyway. Controlling Sevastopol doesn't get them through Istanbul, doesn't get them into the Mediterranean. There isn't even a good strategic reason around the world why Russia would have access to these ports, how it would help them. And the idea that capturing Ukraine, the idea that Russia invading Ukraine is representing the same threat to their sovereignty as Ukraine democratically choosing to join the NATO alliance, the idea that America is this benign hegemony and they've never done anything and blah, 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 that's absolutely not true. I've never said it, but there is the fact that there is an old Eastern European saying that if you call for America, America will come. If you call for Russia, Russia will come. And if you call for no one, Russia will come. There is something to be said for the fact that these countries, whether we're talking the Baltics, whether we're talking Poland, Romania, any Southeastern Europe, there is the fact that these countries are looking towards towards NATO and they want to join NATO. Their citizens are voting to join NATO. We can't even accept just 1 or 2 at a time. It always have to be in batches of 3, 4, or 5 because we don't want to accept only one because it'll cause conflict in the countries because people are so desperate to get into our military alliance. And the only thing that Russia has done with their continued aggression into Ukraine has proven today more than ever a good reason why that alliance still exists. And that's to ensure the security of your country if you are not willing to pursue a nuclear arms program of your own. So I would prefer a world where NATO expands to include more countries than the world that Nick advocates for, where Russia has justification to invade anybody they want, and the only successful path forward if you are a smaller country is to acquire nuclear weapons of your own.
All right, now there are several questions here. Thank you both, gentlemen, here for participating. I didn't have to do much. I just kind of let two old fellows go at it, right? And that's how I prefer it, honestly. I feel like too many times the moderator kind of gets too involved here. It's best to just let the two participants go at it. But I saw this last question just popped up actually, and I don't know how many more I'll ask. Since both you've been generous with your time, but do either of you think we are actually in?
Oh, no Q&A here. Thank God. Let me free. Whew. Editors, are you there? Don't put this on the main channel. I barely said shit. I feel like I'm leeching content right now. I'm doing what Destiny does to me. The Q&A is a separate video. It was a big debate. Destiny did a lot of research. I'm not surprised that he would want to double dip on the monetization. That makes sense. Can we watch the Q&A? No! Christ! The Q&A was good. I don't care! I've been streaming for 11 hours. And half of it has been listening to Destiny and Nick Fuentes, okay? Destiny was pretty darn good. Yes, he was. That was very good performance from Destiny, I would say. Seriously, he did his research there. You know, which one should be expected to, but all the same, it's good that he did. And he came across quite good. I guess the only thing that I wish he'd said, there are two things that I wish he'd done. I don't know if there would have been room for it, but A, the fact that the United States attempted a, you know, popular uprising against Cuba via exiles rather than invading it directly is an indication that even geopolitical superpowers' interests can be affected by the perceived ethics of a situation. And if that's the case, you can make a strong argument that denunciation and, you know, moral outrage against behavior like this can, like, actually curtail the borders of what geopolitical power can do, especially in a democracy. And two, I really wish that Destiny had tried to bring up, like, Israel and, like, the realist perspective just to see how far he could push Fuentes, you know? It might come up in the Q&A. I don't know if I want to watch that, though, because, again, yeah. Nick mentions your name at the end. Yeah, of course. He's been trying to debate me for 2.5 years, except he doesn't want to debate me because he won't just, like, talk to me. Yeah, obviously.